In the spring of 1953, two sisters sat for a photograph that would be reproduced thousands of times over the following decades. Jacqueline Bouvier was engaged to a senator from Massachusetts. Lee Bouvier, younger by 4 years, stood beside her, elegant, composed, already married to a man most people would struggle to remember. The photograph was taken for a society magazine. Both women are smiling. There is nothing visibly wrong. That image and the silence inside it is where this story begins. Lee Radziwill would go on to live a life that most people, by any conventional measure, would call extraordinary. She wore couture, she moved through palaces. She was photographed by the greatest photographers of the 20th century. She was friends with Truman Capote, Andy Warhol, Rudolf Nureyev. She held a title. She traveled on private yachts. She was, by every external standard, a woman who had arrived. And yet, the documentary record of her life, the letters, the interviews, the memoirs that circled her without ever fully capturing her, tells a quieter and more uncomfortable story. A story not of failure in the ordinary sense, but of something harder to name. A life spent in pursuit of a particular kind of recognition that kept moving just beyond reach. A mother whose children grew up in motion between countries and marriages and the social obligations of a woman who needed, above almost everything else, to be seen as significant. This is not a story about jealousy, though jealousy is present. It is not a story about Jackie Kennedy, though Jackie Kennedy is everywhere in it. It is a story about what happens to the people closest to a life like Lee Radziwill's, and what that life, for all its gleaming surfaces, quietly cost them. John Vernu Bouvier III was the kind of man who made a room feel charged when he entered it, and empty when he left. He was handsome in a way that photographs captured well and daily life wore down quickly. He drank. He spent money that wasn't entirely his. He had affairs that were poorly concealed, and, in the social circles the Bouvier moved through, not entirely unexpected. His wife, Janet Lee Bouvier, was disciplined where he was reckless, controlled where he was expansive, and quietly furious in ways that rarely surfaced in public, but shaped everything inside the household on Park Avenue, and later in East Hampton, where the family spent its summers in a rented property that was always slightly less grand than the impression they were trying to maintain. Into this household, on March 3, 1933, Carolyn Lee Bouvier was born. Jacqueline had arrived 3.5 years earlier in 1929. By the time Lee was old enough to understand the atmosphere of the house she'd been born into, its essential tensions were already fixed. Her father adored both daughters in the consuming, performative way of men who are better at adoration than at presence. Her mother managed the family's social position with the focus of someone who understood, perhaps more clearly than anyone else in the household, how quickly it could slip. The Bouvier were not, despite appearances, securely wealthy. The fortune that John Bouvier III projected came largely from his father, and it was already thinning. The lifestyle, the horses, the summer houses, the private schools, the careful maintenance of a particular social image cost more than the income that supported it. This was not discussed openly. In the world the Bouvier occupied, financial anxiety was managed through presentation, and presentation was something Janet Bouvier understood as a form of survival. What this meant for the two Bouvier daughters was an education in surfaces. They learned early and thoroughly that the impression a room received of you mattered more than what was actually happening inside the room. They were dressed carefully, they were taught to ride horses, they were enrolled at Miss Porter's school, where the daughters of established families learned the particular kind of composure that passes, in certain social settings, for character. They were being prepared, though no one would have used the word for a specific kind of life, one in which the primary achievement available to them was an advantageous marriage. Lee was, by most accounts, the more immediately striking of the two sisters as a child and young adolescent. She was smaller, more physically graceful, possessed of a quality that photographers and socialites would later describe as magnetism. Jacqueline was less conventionally pretty in the way the early 1940s rewarded, but she was more intellectually serious, more quietly deliberate. The distinction between them was noted in the household, in their schools, and in the social world their mother was carefully navigating on their behalf. It was the kind of distinction that sounds like a compliment to both parties, but functions, over time, as a ranking. Their parents' marriage deteriorated through Lee's early childhood with a slowness that made it, in some ways, worse than a sudden rupture. John Bouvier's affairs became less concealable. The financial strain became less manageable. Janet's composure became less a social performance and more a form of armor. The divorce, when it finally came in 1940, was handled with the kind of controlled discretion that the Bouvier social world required, but it left a household divided between two parents whose relationship with their daughters was shaped by competition, obligation, and the particular emotional weight that falls on children when they become the primary audience for a failed marriage. Janet Bouvier remarried in 1942 to Hugh Auchincloss, a man of considerably more stable fortune. The marriage lifted the family's financial situation immediately and substantially. There were now proper estates, Hammersmith Farm in Newport, Marywood in Virginia. There were stepchildren from Auchincloss's previous marriages. There was, for the first time in Lee's memory, a household that did not run on carefully managed anxiety about money. What there was not, in any way that seemed to register on Janet or Hugh Auchincloss, was a serious reckoning with what the previous decade had done to the two girls who had grown up inside it. Lee was 9 when her mother remarried. She moved into a larger, more comfortable, more socially established household, and she moved into it as, effectively, a secondary daughter. Jacqueline was older, more serious, already more legible to the adults around her as someone with a particular kind of future. Lee was younger, more decorative in the ways adults noticed, and in a household that was already full of children from multiple marriages, somewhat easier to overlook. This is not to say she was neglected in any simple sense. She was clothed, educated, taken on trips, photographed at horse shows. But there is a particular kind of invisibility that can exist inside a privileged household, one that has nothing to do with material deprivation and everything to do with attention, and the early years at Marywood and Hammersmith Farm seem to have produced in Lee Bouvier a hunger for a specific kind of recognition that the household, despite its size and comfort, did not provide. She and Jackie traveled together to Europe in 1951, a trip funded by Vogue magazine, which had selected Jacqueline as a prize winner in a talent contest. The trip was meant to be formative in the way that European travel was meant to be formative for young American women of their class. Exposure to culture, to history, to the social textures of a different world. Lee went along. She was 18. She saw Paris and London and the social world that European aristocracy and post-war glamour had produced together. She found, in that world, something that felt more calibrated to whatever she was looking for than anything the Newport or Virginia households had offered. She came back to America with a sharper sense of what she wanted, and without yet any clear understanding of what it would cost to want it. Her father, John Bouvier, died in 1957, by which point Lee had already been married once and was moving toward the circumstances that would define the next 2 decades of her life. He died in his apartment at the Westbury Hotel in New York, where he had been living in reduced circumstances for years, largely cut off from the social world he had once occupied. Neither daughter was present at his death. He was found by a building employee. That detail, the particular shape of that ending blank, belongs to a later part of this story, but it began here, in the household on Park Avenue, in the gap between the life the Bouvier appeared to be living and the one they actually were. There is a letter that Lee Bouvier wrote to Jacqueline sometime in the early 1950s, before either of them had married, in which she described feeling in a particular social situation as though she had arrived at a party where someone had already told all her best stories. The letter is warm in tone, self-deprecating in the way that young women of their class were trained to be self-deprecating, and easy to read as the ordinary complaint of a younger sibling navigating a world that kept noticing her older sister first. But the image she chose, not of being overlooked, but of being preceded, of finding her own material already used, is precise in a way that feels less like a passing frustration and more like a diagnosis of something she had been living with for years. The relationship between Lee and Jackie Bouvier was not simple, and the people who knew them both well tended, in later interviews and memoirs, to resist the simplification. It was not a rivalry in the clean sense of two people competing for the same prize. It was something more structural than that, something built into the architecture of the household they had grown up in, and the social world they had been prepared for, where the resources available to women of their background, attention, marriage, position, relevance, were finite in ways that were never openly acknowledged but were always, quietly, understood. Jackie was 4 years older, which in the context of their shared adolescence meant she moved through each social milestone first. She was presented to society first. She attended Vassar and then the Sorbonne and then George Washington University first. She was employed as the inquiring camera girl at the Washington Times-Herald first. She was noticed by the political world of Washington first. Lee, following behind, moved through versions of the same social machinery, but she moved through it in the particular light that a younger sibling occupies, always slightly in the context of what had already happened, always introduced, even in rooms where she was genuinely admired, with a reference point that preceded her. This would matter less or differently if the world they moved through had offered them a wider range of ways to be significant. But the social world of wealthy East Coast American women in the early 1950s was narrow in specific ways. The question that organized most of the attention directed at women like Lee and Jackie Bouvier was not what they would do, but whom they would marry. Their education was real, but its primary social function was preparation for a particular kind of domestic and social role. Their beauty was noted and cultivated not as an end in itself, but as a form of currency in a marriage market that operated with considerable frankness beneath its surface politeness. In this context, the difference between Lee and Jackie was not merely personal, it had a social weight. Jackie was considered by the people who moved through their shared world to be the more serious of the two, more intellectually formidable, more politically legible, better suited, in some quality that was felt rather than articulated, for a certain kind of public life. Lee was considered more beautiful in the conventional sense, more socially fluid, more immediately charming. These were not equal assessments. In the world they inhabited, intellectual seriousness in a woman was admired in the abstract and rewarded in the specific, particularly when it could be attached to a man whose career required a particular kind of wife. Lee understood this. She was not naive about the social mechanics of her world, and the evidence of her letters, her interviews, and the accounts of people who knew her suggests that she grasped, with some clarity, the terms on which she and her sister were being evaluated. What is less clear is what she believed she could do about it, or whether she believed she could do anything at all. What she did in the early 1950s was move. She moved through social situations with the particular kind of energy that comes from someone who is working harder than the room can see. She traveled. She cultivated relationships with people who existed at the edges of the world she had grown up in. Artists, Europeans, people whose sense of what a woman like Lee Bouvier could be was not entirely organized around the question of whose wife she would become. In London and Paris, she found social worlds that received her differently, that responded to her aesthetic sensibility and her physical presence with a kind of attention that felt less comparative, less shadowed by a sister 4 years ahead. But she also, in 1953, made a decision that the social world around her would have recognized as the correct one, and that the evidence of the following years suggests was made at least partly under the pressure of that world's expectations. She married Michael Canfield. Canfield was, on the surface, a reasonable choice by the standards of their social circle. He was handsome, well-connected, employed by a New York publishing house, and possessed of a social ease that made him comfortable in the kinds of rooms the Bouvier daughters moved through. He was also, though this was not publicly known at the time, rumored to be the illegitimate son of Prince George, Duke of Kent, a connection that gave him a faint aristocratic resonance that was not entirely irrelevant to Lee's developing interest in European social worlds. He was 26, Lee was 20. The marriage was not, by the accounts that have survived it, a disaster in the immediate sense. There were apartments in New York and London. There were social engagements and photographs and the surface activity of a young couple living a recognizably fashionable life. But within a relatively short period, the marriage began to reveal itself as something that had been assembled from the right components, without producing the right result. Canfield drank. He was, by several accounts, emotionally unreachable in ways that had not been visible during their courtship. Lee, who had grown up in a household organized partly around the management of a charming, unreliable man, had chosen, with some precision, a version of the same situation. This was 1953. Jackie, that same year, married John F. Kennedy. The weddings were different in nearly every measurable way. Jackie's wedding at Hammersmith Farm was one of the social events of the Newport season. Attended by roughly 700 guests, covered extensively by the press and presided over by the full weight of the Auchincloss social world and the Kennedy political one. Lee's wedding to Canfield had been considerably quieter. The contrast was not accidental, and it was not lost on anyone in their shared social world, including, almost certainly, Lee herself. What followed in the mid-1950s was a period in which the divergence between the two sisters' trajectories became increasingly difficult to ignore. Kennedy was elected to the Senate. Jackie became a senator's wife, a role she occupied with a particular kind of public visibility that the press found compelling. Lee was living partly in London, moving through a social world that was glamorous in its own right, but lacked the specific weight that American political life was beginning to give her sister. The letters between them during this period are, by the accounts of people who have read them, warm but careful. They are the letters of two women who love each other, and are also, with some precision, tracking each other. There is in them, according to people who have described their contents, a recurring quality of Lee measuring herself against a standard that Jackie had set without either of them ever naming that standard directly. By 1957, Lee's marriage to Canfield was effectively finished, though the formal end would come somewhat later. She had already by that point met the man she would marry next, a Polish prince in exile named Lee Radziwill, who moved through London's post-war social world with the particular combination of charm, loss, and reinvention that displaced European aristocracy had been forced to develop. He was 20 years older than Lee. He had a title. He had been married before. He offered something that Michael Canfield, for all his social ease, had not. A world that was entirely separate from the one Jackie Kennedy was coming to occupy. A different geography, a different register of prestige, a different set of rooms in which Lee Bouvier could potentially be the primary figure rather than the secondary one. Whether that was the reason she moved toward him, or part of the reason, or simply the context in which she found herself moving toward him, is not something the record resolves. What the record shows is that she moved, and that she moved quickly, and that the life she was moving toward was one that would give her a title and a prince, and a set of European social connections that glittered at a distance with the promise of finally being, in some room somewhere, the one who had arrived first. Michael Canfield was the kind of man who photographed well at parties and disappeared inside ordinary life. He had the social fluency of someone raised in proximity to money and expectation without quite enough of either to feel secure, and he wore this fluency the way certain men of his generation wore their suits, carefully and with an awareness that the effect depended on not looking too closely. When Lee Bouvier married him in April of 1953, she was 20 years old, recently returned from the European trip that had sharpened her sense of what she wanted, and operating inside a social world that measured a young woman's progress primarily by the speed and quality of her marital decisions. The wedding itself was a modest affair by the standards of what the Bouvier social world could produce. It took place at the Church of St. John the Evangelist in Newport, attended by family and a small circle of friends, and it generated the kind of press coverage that social weddings of its type received. A paragraph or two in the society pages, a photograph, a brief accounting of the bride's dress and the families represented. It was not, in any sense, the event that Jackie's wedding to Kennedy would be 4 months later at the same Newport location, before 700 guests and the full machinery of two politically connected families. Lee's wedding happened first, and it happened smaller, and the sequence of those two events, Lee's quiet April marriage, Jackie's lavish September one, established a pattern that would repeat itself in different registers for the next several decades. What Lee married into, practically speaking, was a life divided between New York and London, organized around the social and professional world that Canfield occupied as an editor at Harper & Brothers. He was well liked in publishing circles, possessed of the kind of low-key intellectual credibility that came from proximity to writers and ideas without the demanding interiority that actual writing required. He knew people. He moved easily through rooms. He had, during their courtship, given Lee every reason to believe that his social ease extended into private life. It did not. The accounts of people who knew the Canfields during their marriage are consistent on this point, without being dramatic about it. Canfield drank, with increasing regularity and decreasing concealment. He was, in the way of certain men whose primary social skill is charm, fundamentally absent when charm was not required, present at dinner parties, and distant at breakfast, engaged in public and unreachable in private. For Lee, who had spent her childhood in a household organized around the management of exactly this kind of man, the dynamic was not unfamiliar. What may have been unfamiliar, or what the evidence of her subsequent choices suggests she had not fully anticipated, was how quickly the life it produced would feel like a room she had already been in. They lived for a period in a flat in London, which suited Lee's developing attachment to European social life, and gave her access to a world that felt, at least initially, less freighted with the particular comparisons that New York carried. London in the mid-1950s was a city still reorganizing itself after the war, its old aristocratic social world thinning at the edges, but still producing the kinds of gatherings where titles and connections and the careful management of diminished fortunes created an atmosphere that American money found exotic and American social ambition found useful. Lee moved through this world with the ease of someone who had been trained for exactly its surface requirements, and she found in it a quality of attention that New York, with its constant reference back to the Kennedy marriage and the Kennedy trajectory, did not provide. But the marriage was thinning alongside the London social world it occupied. By 1955, 2 years in, the distance between what Lee had expected the marriage to provide and what it actually provided had become impossible to manage through the ordinary social performances that kept such distances invisible. Canfield's drinking was not improving. The emotional absence that had been an inconvenience in the early months had calcified into something more structural. There were no children, which in the social world Lee moved through was its own kind of comment on the state of a marriage, though no one made that comment aloud. What Lee did, in the way that she would do throughout her life when a situation had become untenable, was begin moving toward the next thing before the current thing had formally ended. This was not cynicism exactly, and it was not the cold-blooded calculation that some later accounts of her life would suggest. It was something more like a survival mechanism developed in a household where transitions were managed through performance rather than confrontation, where the appearance of continuity was maintained until the last possible moment, and the actual rupture, when it came, was handled as quickly and quietly as the social world required. She had met Stanislaw Radziwill by 1957. The accounts of when exactly they met and under what circumstances vary slightly depending on the source, but the broad outline is consistent. Radziwill was a fixture of London's post-war social world, a Polish aristocrat whose family had lost its estates and much of its fortune to the war and its aftermath, and who had rebuilt himself in London through a combination of property development, social connection, and the particular magnetism of a man whose losses gave him a gravity that men who had never lost anything rarely possessed. He was 40 years old when Lee encountered him. She was 24. He was also still married to his second wife, Grace Colin. At the time their relationship began, a fact that the social world around them registered without treating as an insurmountable obstacle. Divorce among the European social set that Radziwill moved through was not the same kind of event it remained in certain American Catholic social circles, and Lee, whose own marriage was by this point effectively finished in every sense except the legal one, was not in a position to treat another person's marital status as a disqualifying condition. The practicalities took time. Canfield and Lee's divorce was finalized in 1959. Radziwill's divorce from Grace Colin was finalized the same year. Lee and Stas, as he was known, married in 1959 in a civil ceremony in Virginia. Civil because the Catholic Church, which governed the social and spiritual lives of both the Kennedy family and the Bouvier family with considerable practical force, did not recognize the marriages of divorced people in the way that would have permitted a church wedding. The absence of a church ceremony was noted. It would continue to be noted in ways that had practical consequences for years afterward. What is worth pausing on before the Radziwill marriage absorbs the full weight of the next section of this story is what the Canfield marriage had produced in Lee beyond its own failure. She had spent 6 years in a marriage that had given her a life of reasonable comfort and consistent disappointment. She had lived in New York and London and moved through social worlds that received her warmly and offered her no particular foothold. She had watched from a proximity that was close enough to feel, but far enough to distort, as her sister's marriage produced a political career, a public identity, and a kind of national visibility that the social world they had both been trained for recognized as its highest possible output. She had also, during those 6 years, developed with considerable clarity a sense of what she needed, the next stage of her life, to contain. She needed a world that was hers rather than borrowed. She needed a social position that did not derive its primary meaning from its relationship to someone else's position. She needed, in the specific vocabulary of the world she moved through, a title, not as an ornament, but as a kind of proof, a social fact that could not be explained away as proximity or reflection or the accident of having been born 4 years after a sister who kept arriving first. Stanisław Radziwill had a title. He had properties. He had a social world in London and on the European continent that was genuinely his own, assembled from the ruins of one life and the careful construction of another. He was 20 years older than Lee, which in the social world they both occupied carried its own set of meanings. Stability, authority, a kind of formed identity that younger men, with their futures still undetermined, could not offer. What he did not have, and what no document or account from the period seems to have flagged as a relevant consideration, was any particular record of emotional availability. He had been married twice before. He was a man whose charm operated at the same register in public and private, which is to say that it was consistent, and that it was also, in the way of charm that does not modulate with intimacy, a kind of distance wearing a pleasant face. Lee married him in 1959 and moved into a life that had, from the outside, every appearance of being exactly what she had been working toward. There was a house in London, a flat in Paris, later an estate in the English countryside. There was a title. There were invitations to the kinds of gatherings that her previous social world had positioned her to desire without quite delivering. There were, within a few years, 2 children, Anthony, born in 1959, and Christina, born in 1960. The children arrived quickly, in the first years of a marriage that was still assembling itself. They arrived into a household that was, by the measures available to it, a successful one, titled well-connected, financially stable, in the way that Radziwill's property interests in London had made possible, and socially positioned at the intersection of European aristocratic remnant and American glamour that the early 1960s found particularly compelling. What the household was not, and what the speed of its assembly may have made it difficult to notice in the moment, was settled. Lee was 26 when Anthony was born, 27 when Christina arrived. She was simultaneously a new mother, a newly titled woman, a new inhabitant of a social world she was still learning the specific rules of, and the younger sister of a woman whose husband was, by the time Christina was born, a candidate for the presidency of the United States. The children grew up in a household that was always in some register in motion. Stanisław Albrecht Radziwill was born in 1914 into one of the oldest and most storied aristocratic families in Polish history. The Radzywills had been a force in Central European political and cultural life for centuries. Landowners on a scale that made the word inadequate, patrons of architecture and art, figures whose names appeared in the diplomatic correspondence of multiple empires. By the time Stas was born, the family's position was already being eroded by the particular pressures of the early 20th century, but it was still a name that carried in the world it moved through a weight that no amount of post-war reinvention could entirely manufacture from scratch. It was old, it was real, and in the social world of post-war London, where European aristocrats of various degrees of displacement had reassembled themselves into a community held together by shared loss and the practiced performance of continuity, it meant something specific. What it meant practically was that Stas Radziwill moved through London in the 1950s with the particular authority of a man who had lost a great deal and chosen, deliberately and with considerable skill, not to be diminished by the losing. He had served in the Polish army during the war. He had left Poland after the Soviet consolidation of power made return impossible, which meant he had lost not just a fortune, but a geography, a context, the entire physical world in which his identity had been formed. He had rebuilt himself in London through property development, buying and renovating houses in the neighborhoods that post-war London was beginning to reclaim, and through the careful cultivation of a social world that valued exactly what he had to offer: a genuine title, a genuine history, and the kind of company that old names attract even when the estates behind them are gone. He was also, by the accounts of people who knew him during this period, genuinely charming in a way that had nothing theatrical about it. He was interested in people. He was funny in the dry, self-aware way of men who have learned not to take their own dignity too seriously. He was at ease in rooms that would have made a less historically grounded man anxious, and his ease was not the performed ease of social ambition, but something that came from having already survived the worst thing that could happen to a man of his background, and having found on the other side of it that he was still standing. Lee married this man in 1959, and the life they built together in London had, in its early years, a quality of genuine substance that the Canfield marriage had never produced. There was a townhouse in Buckingham Place. There were dinner parties that brought together the remnants of European aristocracy with the newer social world of artists, politicians, and the international set that 1960s London was beginning to assemble. There was, for Lee, the experience of being a hostess in her own right, of organizing a social world around herself, rather than moving through someone else's. The house at Buckingham Place became, in the early 1960s, one of the more quietly notable addresses in London's social life. Lee had a genuine eye for interiors. This was not a pose or a hobby, but a real sensibility, developed over years of moving through beautiful rooms and absorbing, with the attention of someone who had been trained to notice surfaces, what made some of them feel alive and others merely expensive. She worked with the decorator Renzo Mongiardino, who would become a significant figure in her aesthetic life, and the result was a house that people who visited it remembered with unusual specificity. The colors, the textures, the way objects were arranged to suggest a history that was partly real and partly composed. This capacity for creating an atmosphere, for making a space feel inhabited by a specific sensibility, was one of Lee's genuine talents, and it is worth noting here because it would surface repeatedly throughout her life in ways that never quite resolved into a career, always remaining slightly in the category of gift rather than profession, admired but not taken entirely seriously by the social world that admired it. In the early 1960s, inside the Buckingham Place house, it was simply one of the things that made the Radziwill household a place people wanted to be. Anthony was born in August of 1959, a few months after his parents' civil marriage. Christina followed in 1960. The children arrived into the London household during a period when their parents' social life was, by any external measure, at its most active and most successful. The dinners, the travel, the constant movement between London and the continent, and increasingly the United States, where Lee's sister was now the wife of a president. All of this meant that the household Anthony and Christina were born into was one organized primarily around adult social life, with children present in the way that children of their class and period were present, attended to, provided for, moved between nurseries and schools and holiday houses, but not, in any structural sense, the organizing principle of the life around them. This was not unusual. In the social world the Radziwills occupied, children were raised by a combination of nannies, schools, and the periodic focused attention of parents whose primary identities were not domestic. The assumption embedded in this arrangement was that provision, material comfort, good schools, social exposure was equivalent to presence, that what children needed was adequately supplied by the infrastructure of a wealthy household, even when the parents themselves were elsewhere. It was an assumption so thoroughly built into the culture of that world that it rarely surfaced as an assumption at all. It was simply how things were done. What it produced in practice was a particular kind of childhood. Anthony and Christina grew up in beautiful houses that changed frequently. They were cared for by people who were paid to care for them. Their parents were glamorous and periodically present and connected to a world that seemed, from the outside, to be the most important world there was. They attended good schools. They lacked for nothing material. And they grew up, as children in these circumstances often do, with a highly developed capacity for navigating adult social environments and a somewhat less developed experience of sustained, unperformed parental attention. The title mattered to Lee in ways that went beyond the social. She was, after her marriage to Radziwill, Princess Lee Radziwill, and the form of a dress, the way it organized the attention of rooms, the way it preceded her into social situations, the way it gave her presence a weight that was independent of her relationship to Jackie Kennedy, provided something that she had been working toward, in one form or another, since the early 1950s. It was a fixed point. It was hers in a way that her beauty, her taste, and her social fluency were not entirely hers, because those could always be relativized, compared, measured against another standard. But titles, in the world of the early 1960s, were also beginning to shift in their social meaning. The post-war reorganization of Europe had produced a surplus of displaced aristocracy, and the title market, if one could call it that, was experiencing something like inflation. There were a great many princes and counts and baronesses in London and Paris and New York, and not all of them had Radziwill's genuine historical grounding, which meant that the category was becoming harder to read from the outside, that the weight a title carried depended increasingly on what surrounded it. The house, the connections, the behavior, the particular quality of life that was assembled around the name. Lee understood this, and the effort she put into the Buckingham Place house, into the dinner parties, into the cultivation of friendships with people who existed at the intersection of art and money and genuine European social history, was partly an effort to supply the title with the substance that would make it legible in exactly the right way. She was not simply a princess, she was a princess with a Mongiardino interior and a Nureyev at her dinner table, and a sister in the White House. The combination was, for a period in the early 1960s, genuinely formidable. Stas, for his part, occupied the marriage with the same quality of ease he brought to everything. Present, charming, fundamentally self-contained in a way that Lee's need for recognition occasionally strained against. He was not a man who withheld affection so much as a man whose affection was not organized around the particular frequency of attention that Lee required. He had his own life, his business interests, his friendships, the specific gravity of a man who had survived serious historical disruption and come out the other side with a settled sense of who he was. He did not need the dinner parties to feel real. He attended them, he enjoyed them, he was good at them. But they were not, for him, what they were for Lee. This difference between a man for whom social life was pleasure and a woman for whom it was partly necessity was not dramatic in the early years of the marriage. It was the kind of difference that a busy social life can absorb easily, that only becomes visible when the social life quiets or when something happens that the social life cannot address. In 1963, something happened that no dinner party, no title, no Mongiardino interior could address or contain or organize into the right kind of meaning. But that belongs to a later point in this account. In the early 1960s, the Radziwill marriage was still functioning, still producing the social world that Lee had worked to build, still giving both Anthony and Christina a household that looked, from any reasonable external vantage point, like exactly what a privileged childhood was supposed to look like, what it looked like from the inside, from the particular vantage point of two small children. Being raised in a household organized around adult social performance is harder to recover from the record. Anthony was 3 in 1962. Christina was 2. They were, by all accounts, healthy, attended to, moved through the beautiful spaces their parents assembled and reassembled across London and Paris and, increasingly, the United States, where their aunt had recently become the most photographed woman in the world. They were growing up in the orbit of something enormous, something that cast a light that made everything it touched look significant and left, in its shadow, a particular kind of darkness that would take years to become visible. In January of 1961, John F. Kennedy was inaugurated as the 35th President of the United States, and Lee Radziwill flew to Washington to watch her sister become First Lady. The ceremony was held in bitter cold. the kind of Washington January that makes the marble of the Capitol building look like something carved from ice, and the photographs from that day show Lee in the crowd, elegant, composed, positioned at the edge of the frame in the way that people who are related to the central figure, but are not themselves the central figure, are always positioned at the edge of the frame. She is there. She is clearly there. But the camera and the historical record and the attention of the country assembled around that moment are organized around someone else. This was the shape that the next 3 years would take for Lee. Not absence, she was present, frequently and visibly, in the world the Kennedy White House produced. She visited Washington. She traveled with Jackie on official and semi-official trips. She was photographed at the kinds of events that the Kennedy administration generated, with a regularity that made the early 1960s feel, in retrospect, like a sustained exercise in the production of images. She was, in the vocabulary of that world, an insider. She had access. She was the First Lady's sister, which in the social geography of the Kennedy years was a position that carried genuine weight and genuine visibility. What it was not was a position that had any content of its own. The distinction matters because Lee had spent the previous several years building. Through her marriage to Radziwill and the social world she had assembled around it, a life that had its own center of gravity. In London, she was Princess Radziwill, a woman whose social position derived from her own marriage, her own household, her own cultivated connections. The title was hers. The house was hers. The dinner parties were hers. When she walked into a room in London, the room organized itself around her in a way that had nothing to do with Jackie Kennedy. In Washington, and in the broader American public consciousness that the Kennedy White House was generating and sustaining with extraordinary intensity, Lee occupied a different position entirely. She was the sister. She was the prettier one, some people said, though this was itself a kind of diminishment. The suggestion that her primary attribute was aesthetic, and that even this attribute was understood in relation to someone else. She was the one who had married a Polish prince, which sounded glamorous and was glamorous, but which, in the specific register of American political celebrity, that the Kennedy administration had made the dominant cultural frequency of the early 1960s, was a kind of glamour that did not quite translate. European aristocratic titles were interesting, they were not powerful, and power in the Kennedy White House was the thing that organized the room. Lee navigated this with the composure she had been trained to maintain in situations that were, beneath their social surface, uncomfortable. She was photographed with Jackie at official events and on private trips. She was included in the social life of the White House in ways that made her visible without making her significant. She attended state dinners. She was present at the kinds of gatherings that the Kennedy administration used to signal its particular combination of political seriousness and cultural sophistication. The Pablo Casals concert at the White House in November of 1961, the dinner for André Malraux in May of 1962, the events that were designed to establish the Kennedy White House as a place where power and culture occupied the same rooms without either diminishing the other. At these events, Lee was always correctly placed. She wore the right things. She said the right things to the right people. She was, by every account of people who were present, genuinely good in those rooms, charming without being aggressive, interested without being obsequious, possessed of the social intelligence to know which conversations to join and which to leave. But she was good in those rooms in the way that a skilled supporting performer is good, in a way that served the larger production without generating its own narrative. There was a trip to India and Pakistan in March of 1962 that crystallized this dynamic with particular clarity. Jackie Kennedy traveled to the subcontinent on a semi-official goodwill visit, accompanied by Lee, and the journey produced the kind of press coverage that everything Jackie did in those years produced. Extensive, reverential, focused with almost uncomfortable intensity on every detail of her appearance, her manner, her effect on the people she encountered. The photographs from India are among the most reproduced images of Jackie Kennedy's life. The Taj Mahal, the elephant rides, the formal receptions with Jawaharlal Nehru, the careful choreography of American soft power in the early Cold War period. Lee is in some of those photographs. She is in many of the situations those photographs document. She rode the same elephants, attended the same receptions, moved through the same extraordinary landscape. The press coverage of the trip generated approximately one story about Lee for every 15 about Jackie. This was not spite and it was not oversight. It was the accurate reflection of where the attention was and where it was not. And it was a ratio that Lee, who was not unaware of press coverage and its implications, registered with the precision of someone who had been tracking that particular ratio for most of her adult life. What she did with the registration, what internal account she maintained of the distance between the life the Kennedy years were making for Jackie and the life they were making or not making for Lee is not recoverable from the public record with any precision. The people who knew her during this period describe her as characteristically composed, characteristically witty, characteristically capable of making any situation she was in feel through the quality of her attention and the acuity of her observations, like a situation worth being in. She did not, in public or in the accounts of friends, perform resentment. She did not position herself as a rival. She was visibly a devoted sister, and the devotion was real. The letters between them during this period are affectionate. The practical support Lee offered Jackie during difficult moments in the Kennedy marriage was genuine, and the evidence does not support the simpler narrative of two women locked in open competition. But there is a particular kind of accommodation that people make when the circumstances of their lives require them to exist in a subordinate position that they did not choose and cannot change. And that accommodation leaves traces. It leaves them in the texture of the decisions people make about what to pursue and what to let go, in the relationships they form and the ones they avoid, in the quality of attention they bring to the parts of their lives that are genuinely theirs versus the parts they inhabit as supporting figures in someone else's story. In the early 1960s, Lee was assembling evidence. She was noting, with the precision of someone trained from childhood to read social situations accurately, what the Kennedy years were producing for Jackie and what they were not producing for her. She was living simultaneously in the London world that was genuinely hers and in the American world that kept offering her a specific, limited, and ultimately subordinate place. And she was beginning, not yet urgently but with increasing frequency, to think about what it would mean to have something of her own, a career, a public identity, a form of recognition that did not pass through her relationship to her sister. The thinking had not yet produced anything concrete. She was, in these years, also a mother of two young children, which occupied a portion of her practical life, even if the infrastructure of nannies and schools meant that motherhood did not organize her days in the way it organized the days of women without the resources she had. Anthony was 3 and 4 during the India trip and its aftermath. Christina was 2 and 3. They were in London, in the Buckingham Palace house, in the care of the people employed to care for them, while their mother was photographed on elephants in Rajasthan and at state dinners in Washington and at the kinds of events that the Kennedy years kept generating with their extraordinary, exhausting, and ultimately temporary intensity. The temporariness was not yet visible. In the spring and summer of 1963, the Kennedy White House was still at the height of whatever it was: political project, cultural phenomenon, sustained act of national image-making. Lee was still moving between London and Washington, between her own social world and her sister's larger one, managing the distance between them with the composure and the wit and the very real affection that characterized her public relationship with Jackie throughout this period. Jackie was pregnant in the summer of 1963 with a third child, a boy named Patrick, who was born prematurely on August 7th and died 2 days later. Lee flew to Boston immediately. She was at the hospital. She was with Jackie in the days that followed, when the loss was raw and the public world, which had been tracking the pregnancy with its customary intensity, was generating the kind of coverage that turns private grief into national event. Lee was present for this in the way she was present for the difficult moments, quietly, practically, without the performance of grief that the public situation might have invited. 2 months later, in October of 1963, Lee arranged for Jackie to join her and Stas on a vacation cruise in the Greek islands, aboard the yacht of a man Lee had known for several years, a Greek shipping magnate whose scale of wealth and whose particular kind of extravagant hospitality were famous in the international social world both women moved through. The trip was intended as a recuperation, a removal from Washington, and its pressures and the grief that the loss of Patrick had left behind. The man whose yacht they sailed on was Aristotle Onassis. The Christina, Onassis's yacht, named for his daughter, was, by the standards of private vessels in 1963, something close to a floating assertion of will. It was 325 feet long. It had been converted from a Canadian frigate after the war and rebuilt to a specification that reflected Onassis's particular relationship with money, which was not the relationship of someone who had always had it and therefore did not need to demonstrate it, but the relationship of someone who had made it from almost nothing and understood its primary social function as the power to make other people feel the weight of your presence. There was a bar with stools upholstered in whale foreskin, a fact that Onassis was known to mention to guests with a satisfaction that said something about the specific register of his sensibility. There was a pool that could be converted into a dance floor. There were enough staff to run a small hotel. It was not a yacht in the sense that suggested leisure. It was a yacht in the sense that suggested dominion. Lee had been on it before. Her relationship with Aristotle Onassis predated the October 1963 cruise by several years, and its exact nature, whether it was, at any point, romantic, and if so, to what degree and for how long, is one of those questions that the people closest to it handled, both during and after, with a discretion so consistent that it functions, in the historical record, almost as a shape defined by what surrounds it. What is clear is that Lee knew him well. What is clear is that she moved through his world with the ease of someone who had spent real time in it. What is clear is that she arranged the October cruise, that she invited Jackie, and that she did so with the genuine intention of providing her sister with a recuperative escape from Washington and from grief. What happened on and around that cruise and in the months and years that followed it is the moment in Lee's life where the historical record becomes most contested and where the emotional texture of her relationship with her sister becomes hardest to read from the outside. Onassis was attentive to Jackie during the cruise in the way that Onassis was attentive to everything he found interesting, completely, with the focused energy of a man who did not distribute his attention thinly. The other guests noticed. The press, which had been tracking the First Lady's recuperative vacation with its usual intensity, noticed from the dock. Jackie noticed. Lee noticed too. She did not say so publicly. She did not say so, as far as the record shows, even privately, in any document that has survived or been shared. The people who knew her well during this period and the years that followed describe, when they describe this at all, a quality of careful neutrality in how Lee discussed Onassis and Jackie, a neutrality that is itself a kind of information, the studied absence of a reaction that would be natural in someone who had introduced a man she knew intimately to a sister who then became that man's primary focus. Kennedy was assassinated 6 weeks after the cruise ended, on November 22, 1963, in Dallas. Lee was in New York when it happened. She flew to Washington immediately and was at the White House within hours, one of the first people to reach Jackie after the motorcade, after Parkland Memorial Hospital, after Air Force One and the swearing-in ceremony that happened with Lyndon Johnson while Jackie still wore the pink Chanel suit with her husband's blood on it. Lee was in the White House for the days that followed, the lying in state, the funeral, the extraordinary compressed duration of public grief that those 4 days produced. She was present for it in the way she was always present for the worst moments, without theater, without self-reference, with the whole of her attention directed at her sister. What the assassination did to Jackie Kennedy is a question that entire libraries have addressed with varying degrees of insight. What it did to the social and personal world around Jackie, the world that included Lee, is less documented and in some ways more interesting, because it produced a reorganization of relationships and trajectories that played out over years and that the public drama of the assassination itself tends to obscure. For Lee, November 1963 produced a specific set of consequences. Her sister was now a widow, a former First Lady, one of the most recognizable and most mythologized women in the world, and a woman who had been moved by grief into a new relationship with her own public identity. More guarded, more controlled, more aware of what exposure cost. The White House years were over. The particular dynamic of Lee existing in Jackie's Washington orbit, the managed subordination of the Kennedy years, was over too. But what replaced it was not, as Lee might reasonably have hoped, a reorganization that gave her more room. What replaced it was something harder to navigate, a sister transformed by tragedy into a figure of such overwhelming public significance that the proximity to her became, if anything, more consuming rather than less. The years between 1963 and 1968 were years in which Lee made repeated attempts to establish an independent public identity, and they were also years in which her relationship with Onassis continued in whatever form it had always taken, complicated now by Jackie's presence in the picture. Onassis moved in and out of both women's lives during this period with the ease of a man who understood that his wealth made him immune to the social consequences that would have attached to anyone else navigating the same situation. He was a presence at Lee's dinner parties. He was a presence in Jackie's grief-adjacent social world. He sent flowers and gifts and made telephone calls and was, in the way of very powerful men with resources that most people cannot imagine, attentive to both women simultaneously in ways that required each of them to manage, without acknowledgement, the question of what exactly he was to the other one. In 1968, Onassis married Jackie Kennedy. The announcement came in October of that year, and it produced in the American and international press a reaction of genuine shock that reflected how thoroughly the public had constructed a particular narrative about Jackie Kennedy's future and how completely the marriage violated it. The coverage was enormous, the commentary was extensive, and embedded in both was a quality of prurient attention to what the marriage meant about Jackie. Her judgment, her grief, her relationship to money and to the Kennedy legacy. That said a great deal about how women of extraordinary public visibility are treated when they make choices that the public did not script for them. Lee was not quoted in the coverage. She issued no statement. The people around her in the days and weeks after the announcement describe her as composed, the word that appears most consistently in accounts of Lee in moments of difficulty, a word that by this point in her life had accumulated enough repetitions to suggest not equanimity, but its performance. What she said privately, in letters or in conversations that have been recorded by the people she had them with, reflects the specific texture of a betrayal that she could not name as a betrayal without naming things she had chosen not to name. Truman Capote, who was among her closest friends during this period and who was constitutionally incapable of discretion, told multiple people over multiple years that Lee had been devastated, not by the marriage in the simple sense of romantic loss, but by the particular quality of what it meant for her relationship with her sister. That Jackie had taken something that was, in whatever sense, in Lee's world first, that the taking had happened without direct acknowledgement, that the social performance required of Lee in response, the composed acceptance, the public loyalty, the careful neutrality, was a performance she was required to give without anyone acknowledging that it was a performance. Capote was not a reliable narrator. He was a man who loved drama and who loved Lee and who would have shaped whatever she told him into the version that served the best story. But the core of what he described, the specific quality of a wound that cannot be articulated because articulating it would require admitting things that have been carefully not admitted, is consistent with what the record of Lee's behavior in the years around 1968 shows. She did not attend the wedding. The official explanation was that she was unwell. There is no reason to interrogate that explanation very hard. What the Onassis marriage produced in Lee's practical life was a reorganization of her relationship to both her sister and to the specific geography of European wealth that Onassis represented. She had moved through that geography as a known figure, as someone whose connection to Onassis gave her a particular standing in the world of Greek islands and international yachts and the social life that existed at the intersection of old money and new. After October 1968, that geography was Jackie's. The yacht was Jackie's. The island of Scorpios, which Onassis owned, and where the wedding took place, was Jackie's. The world that Lee had, in some sense, introduced her sister to, had reorganized itself entirely around the sister. There were two children in London being raised by the infrastructure of the Radziwill household while all of this was happening. Anthony was 9 in 1968. Christina was 8. They were at school in England, moving through the routines of an upper-class English childhood, attended by the people employed to attend to them, aware in the way that children of their age and intelligence are aware of things that the adults around them are not discussing. Their mother was in New York and London and the south of France, and wherever else the social world she moved through required her to be. Their father was managing his property interests and his social life with the self-contained efficiency of a man whose primary relationship was always with his own equilibrium. The household continued, the schools continued, the beautiful houses continued. What continued alongside them, invisibly, was the accumulation of absences that no material provision could retroactively fill, and the growing legibility, to anyone watching carefully, of two children being raised at the edge of their parents' attention rather than at its center. Lee, in 1968, was 35 years old. She had a title, a marriage of 9 years that was beginning to show the specific strains of two people whose needs had never quite aligned. Two children she loved in the way the evidence consistently suggests, genuinely, periodically, and from a distance that the structure of her life kept producing, and that the structure of her self-understanding may not have allowed her to fully see. She was also, for the first time in her adult life, in a situation where the social architecture she had built, the title, the European world, the proximity to Onassis's orbit, had been substantially reorganized by her sister's choices, and where the question of what Lee Radziwill was, independent of the people and world she moved through, had become impossible to defer any longer. She would spend the next decade trying to answer it in ways that were brave and misguided and revealing, and that produced for Anthony and Christina a mother who was increasingly elsewhere. Not geographically always, but in the specific quality of presence that children require, and that no amount of beautiful houses and good schools and periodic focused attention can substitute for. There is a photograph taken sometime in the early 1960s in the garden of the Radziwill house in the English countryside that shows Anthony and Christina as small children, Anthony perhaps 3 or 4, Christina a year younger, standing in the kind of careful clothes that children of their background wore for photographs, which is to say clothes that were beautiful and slightly impractical, and that signaled, to anyone who understood the signal, the specific register of the household they belonged to. They are standing close together in the photograph, which is perhaps the most significant thing about it. Not close to an adult, close to each other. The English countryside house, Turville Grange in Buckinghamshire, which the Radziwills rented and later acquired, was, by any objective measure, an extraordinary place for children to grow up. It was large. It had grounds. It had the specific quality of English rural life that the wealthy of that period valued. The horses, the dogs, the physical space of fields and woods that gave children's days a texture that London or Paris could not provide. Photographs of the house show the kind of interior that Lee's eye produced, layered, warm, full of objects with histories, the kind of rooms that feel inhabited rather than decorated. It was genuinely beautiful. It was also like the Buckingham Place townhouse and the Paris flat and the various other properties the Radziwills occupied during the 1960s, a place that its primary adult residents moved through rather than stayed in. The word that appears most consistently in the accounts of people who knew the Radziwill household during Anthony and Christina's childhood is staff. There were nannies, in the plural, across the years. There were housekeepers and cooks and the particular infrastructure of domestic service that households of the Radziwills type maintained as a matter of course. This infrastructure was competent, and in the accounts that survive, genuinely caring in the way that professional child rearers can be caring, consistently present, reliably attentive, organized around the practical needs of the children in a way that their parents, whose primary obligations were social and whose social lives were organized around adult time rather than children's time, were not always able to be. What this meant for Anthony and Christina was that the people most consistently present in their daily lives were not their parents. This is not a scandalous observation in the context of their class and period. It describes with complete accuracy the childhood of a very large number of children raised in wealthy households in mid-20th century Britain and Europe. The nanny system was not considered neglect. It was considered appropriate provision, and the adults who employed it generally believed, without much examination, that the quality of the provision compensated for the quantity of their own presence. But children do not experience the consistency of a nanny's presence and the periodicity of a parent's as equivalent, regardless of the material quality of both. They experience the difference. They organize themselves around it. They develop in response to it particular strategies for managing their own needs, for reading the temperature of adult attention when it is present, for finding in each other the continuity that the rotating cast of adult presences cannot quite supply. Anthony and Christina were close in the way that children who rely primarily on each other become close. The accounts of people who knew them as children and as young adults describe a relationship of unusual depth and consistency. Not the ordinary sibling closeness of children who happen to share a household, but something more load-bearing, the closeness of two people who had identified each other as the most reliable element in an environment organized primarily around adult priorities. They played together. They looked after each other. In the particular emotional vocabulary of their childhood, they were, in a way, that neither of them could have articulated at the time, each other's primary attachment. This dynamic, two children turned primarily toward each other in a beautiful, well-staffed, and parentally intermittent household, was set early, and it set hard. By the time Anthony was 10 and Christina 9, the pattern was established. Their parents were present in the way that their parents were present, glamorously, periodically, with the quality of focused attention that adults bring to children when they are not distracted by their own social obligations, which in the Radziwill household was not, by the evidence, a frequent condition. Lee's relationship with her children during this period is one of the most difficult aspects of her life to reconstruct with precision, because the primary sources are limited and the accounts that exist are filtered through the perspectives of people who had their own relationships with the family. What the record suggests, assembled from the accounts of friends, from the occasional interview in which Lee discussed her children, and from the testimony of people who knew Anthony and Christina as adults reflecting on their childhood, is a mother who loved her children with genuine intensity and who was also, with equal genuineness, not organized around them. She thought about them. She worried about them. She was, in the moments of crisis that their childhoods produced, present with a focus that people who witnessed it found moving. But the day-to-day texture of motherhood, the continuity, the routines, the sustained and unperformed presence that constitutes the background of a child's sense of being held, was provided in the Radziwill household primarily by the people who were paid to provide it. The moves did not help. The Radziwill household during Anthony and Christina's childhood was not a fixed geography. It was London and Buckinghamshire and Paris and, with increasing frequency as the 1960s progressed, New York, where Lee's social life was expanding and where the proximity to Jackie, now widowed, now living on Fifth Avenue, created a gravitational pull that the London household could not entirely counteract. Each move required the children to leave schools, to leave the friends they had made, to re-establish themselves in a new social environment with the specific combination of resilience and isolation that boarding school and frequent relocation produces in children who are good at it. Anthony and Christina were, by the accounts of the people who knew them at school, good at it. They adapted, they made friends. They presented the composed, socially capable surfaces that their background had trained them to present. The adaptation was real, but adaptation is not the same as ease, and the composed surfaces that boarding school children develop are not, in the children themselves, experienced as composure. They are experienced as effort, as the daily expenditure of a specific kind of energy that leaves less energy for everything else, for the ordinary messiness of childhood, for the development of a self that does not need to manage its own presentation, for the particular safety of feeling that someone is paying attention, regardless of whether you are performing. Anthony was sent to boarding school in England at an age consistent with the practices of his class. 7 or 8, by the accounts that survive. Christina followed a similar trajectory. The English boarding school system of the 1960s was not, by contemporary standards, a gentle environment. It was structured around the production of a specific kind of person, self-reliant, emotionally contained, capable of functioning within hierarchical social structures without showing the cost of that functioning. It was, in other words, a system that formalized and institutionalized the same qualities that the Radziwill household had been producing informally since Anthony and Christina were old enough to understand that the adults in their lives were elsewhere. The marriage between Lee and Stas was deteriorating through the mid-1960s in the gradual, low-temperature way of marriages between people who are not unhappy enough to leave quickly and not compatible enough to stay contentedly. Stas's business interests kept him occupied. Lee's social world and her increasing preoccupation with finding a form of independent public recognition kept her occupied. The household ran on the infrastructure they had established. The children moved through that infrastructure with the practiced competence of children who have learned not to need too much. There were good moments. The accounts of Anthony and Christina as children are not uniformly bleak. They are, in fact, full of the ordinary pleasures of privileged childhood, the summers and the horses and the houses, and the particular delight of two children who genuinely liked each other, inhabiting a world of considerable material beauty. Lee took them to Greece, to the south of France, to New York. She took them on occasion to Scorpios, where Onassis, first her intimate, then her sister's husband, received them with the expansive generosity that he brought to everything he hosted. They swam in extraordinary water. They sat at tables where famous people talked. They were, in the specific experiential sense, exposed to a world of extraordinary richness. What they were not, by the accounts that survive, given a great deal of information about their own family, about the tensions in their parents' marriage, about their mother's complicated relationship with her sister, about the specific weight of the world they had been born into, and what it required of the people who inhabited it. Children in their social world were not explained to. They were prepared. The preparation was rigorous and the explanation was minimal, which meant that Anthony and Christina spent their childhoods in proximity to enormous social and emotional complexity that they could feel but could not name, organized around a set of adult relationships whose actual dynamics were managed, in the tradition of their world, entirely beneath the social surface. By 1968, when Onassis married Jackie and the reorganization of the adult world around them accelerated, Anthony was 9 and Christina 8. They were old enough to understand that something had happened, that the adult world they moved through had shifted in some way that the adults around them were not discussing. They were not old enough to understand what it was, and there was, in the Radziwill household, no adult who was going to explain it to them. What they had was each other, which was what they had always had, and which would remain, through the divorce that was coming, through the moves and the schools and the years of their mother's increasingly restless search for a self that her social world would recognize as significant, the most consistent fact of their lives. Anthony Radziwill and his sister Christina grew up understanding, in the wordless way that children understand the essential truths of their households, that the world they inhabited was organized around priorities that did not include them at the center. This understanding did not make them bitter, at least not visibly, and it did not, in the accounts of people who knew them as young adults, produce the kinds of obvious damage that appear in simpler stories about neglected children. It produced something more subtle and more durable, a quality of self-sufficiency that looked like confidence and sometimes was, and a quality of emotional hunger that looked like sociability and sometimes was that too, and a relationship with each other that was the most honest and most sustaining relationship either of them would have for a very long time. The divorce came in 1974. By then, Anthony was 15 and Christina 13. They were old enough this time to understand what was happening. Whether understanding made it easier is a question the record does not answer. In the fall of 1967, Lee Radziwill appeared on the stage of the Chicago Ivanhoe Theater in a production of the play Anastasia, taking the title role of the woman who claimed to be the surviving daughter of the last Russian Tsar. The casting had been arranged partly through the efforts of her friend and advocate Truman Capote, who believed with the specific enthusiasm he brought to projects involving people he loved that Lee possessed a genuine theatrical talent that the world had not yet had the opportunity to witness. The production was not a major commercial venture. It was the kind of regional theater engagement that functions in the careers of people arriving late to performance as a trial, a contained environment in which something can be tested without the full weight of public judgment that a Broadway opening or a major film would bring. The reviews were not good. They were not catastrophic in the way that produces lasting notoriety, but they were clear in the particular way that theater critics are clear when they are trying to be kind about something that does not merit kindness. Attentive to her appearance, respectful of her effort, and largely silent about the thing that matters in a performance, which is whether the person on the stage is producing something that the audience believes. The Chicago critics did not, for the most part, believe Lee Radziwill as Anastasia. They noted her beauty. They noted her composure. They noted that she was Princess Radziwill, the sister of Jacqueline Kennedy, which was a fact that no review of anything she did could avoid noting, and which functioned, in the context of a theatrical assessment, as a way of explaining her presence on the stage without addressing what she did once she was there. She had prepared seriously. This is worth establishing because the easier narrative, the socialite who wandered onto a stage on the strength of connections and fame by association, does not match the account of people who were involved in the production or who watched her prepare for it. She worked with coaches. She learned the role. She brought to the rehearsal process the focused attention that she brought to the things she genuinely cared about, and the evidence suggests that she genuinely cared about this. The theater was not, for Lee, a vanity project in the simple sense. It was an attempt, serious, considered, and ultimately unsuccessful, to find a form of public identity that was entirely her own, that could not be explained as a function of her marriage or her sister, or the social world she moved through. The attempt had a specific logic. Lee was 34 in 1967. She had spent her adult life in a world that valued her for qualities, her beauty, her taste, her social ease, her connections, that were either inherited or cultivated in service of a social role rather than a professional one. None of these qualities produced in the vocabulary of the mid-20th century a career. They produced a life, a very comfortable and very visible life, but not an identity of the kind that she seemed, by the evidence of the choices she was making, to be looking for. The theater offered something that the social world could not, a form of recognition that was based, at least in principle, on what you did rather than what you were, on performance in the professional sense rather than the social one. That the professional performance turned out to require the same qualities as the social one: composure, presence, the management of a surface, and that Lee was better at producing those qualities in one context than the other, was a discovery that the Anastasia reviews delivered with the blunt efficiency of public assessments. She did not return to the stage after Chicago. What she returned to in the years between the Anastasia production and the end of her marriage was a series of projects that followed a pattern consistent enough to feel structural rather than coincidental. Each project was real, genuinely pursued, genuinely prepared for, genuinely connected to something in Lee's actual sensibility and interests. Each project generated a period of public interest and social excitement. Each project either did not materialize fully or materialized into something less substantial than its beginning had suggested. And each project was followed, after a period of recalibration, by another project with the same essential shape. In 1968, Truman Capote wrote a television adaptation of his short story Laura and cast Lee in the title role. The production aired in January of 1968 and received reviews that were, if anything, more clearly negative than the Anastasia notices had been. The television format offered less shelter than regional theater. It broadcast the performance into living rooms across the country, where it was received by audiences and critics who did not have the social context that the Chicago theater's proximity to the Radziwill world had provided, and who assessed it with the unmediated directness of people watching a screen. The consensus was consistent. Lee was beautiful, she was present, and she was not, in any technically meaningful sense, acting. Capote's loyalty to Lee did not waver after Laura, but the practical usefulness of that loyalty as a mechanism for generating performance opportunities was effectively exhausted. He could get her the roles. He could not, with all his genuine affection and all his considerable influence, make the performances work. And Lee, who was intelligent about most things, and who was not, by the accounts of people who knew her well, incapable of accurate self-assessment, seems to have understood after Laura that the performance path was not going to produce what she had hoped it would produce. The understanding did not come cleanly or immediately. There were conversations in the years after Laura about other roles, other projects, a film here, a stage production there, that did not materialize. There was a period in which the possibility of an acting career remained open enough to be discussed without being active enough to be pursued. This is the texture of professional ambitions that have not formally failed, but have quietly stopped moving forward. And it is a texture that people who knew Lee during this period describe with the careful language of people who liked her and did not want to be unkind about something that had clearly cost her something real. Interior design was different. It was not a consolation prize, and it is important not to present it as one, because it engaged something in Lee that was genuinely hers, in a way that the acting had never quite been. Her eye was real. The houses she created, the Buckingham Place house, the apartments she would later design in New York, the various spaces she worked on with Mongiardino and later independently, had a quality that the people who inhabited them or visited them described with a consistency that suggests the quality was not just social politeness. She understood how spaces worked on people. She understood color and texture and the specific weight of objects arranged in relation to each other. She understood in a way that cannot be entirely taught, and that her years of moving through beautiful rooms had developed, rather than created, what made a room feel the way she wanted it to feel. In the early 1970s, she began working more formally as an interior designer, taking on clients outside her immediate social circle and approaching the work with the professional seriousness that her earlier performance projects had received and not been able to use. The work generated attention. She was inevitably Lee Radziwill, and her name attached to a design project produced the kind of press coverage that names like hers produce. But it also generated, among the people who hired her and the people who saw the results, a more substantive form of respect than the acting reviews had offered. But interior design, in the social world Lee moved through, occupied a specific position. It was admired. It was considered an appropriate expression of a wealthy woman's sensibility. It was not, in the vocabulary of that world, a serious career in the way that a legal career or a political career or even a sustained acting career would have been serious. It was taste formalized, which was valuable and genuine, but which did not produce the specific kind of public recognition that Lee had been pursuing since the mid-1960s. The recognition that said not this woman has beautiful rooms, but this woman has done something. The distinction may seem fine from the outside, and in material terms it was fine. Lee was not suffering for lack of professional achievement in any way that touched her daily life. But she had been trying, since at least 1967, to find a form of public identity that would exist independently of her marriage, her title, and her sister, and the attempts had produced each time something that fell just short of what she was looking for. The theater had failed directly. The television had failed directly. The design work was succeeding, but succeeding in a register that the world she moved through placed slightly below the level of significance she was reaching for. There was also, running alongside the career attempts of the late 1960s and early 1970s, the increasing strain of the Radziwill marriage, which was providing less and less of the social and emotional scaffolding that it had provided in its earlier years. Stas was aging. He was 20 years Lee's senior, and by the early 1970s he was in his late 50s, less interested in the social activity that had organized their shared life, less connected to the specific world that Lee was trying to navigate. His health was beginning to raise concerns that neither of them discussed publicly. The marriage had produced over 15 years, a social world, and 2 children, and a title, and a set of houses. And it had not produced, had perhaps never been equipped to produce, the particular form of intimate recognition that Lee had been looking for since the household on Park Avenue, where she had first learned what it felt like not to be seen quite clearly enough. Anthony was 12 or 13 during the years when the marriage was most visibly failing. Christina was 11 or 12, They were at their English schools, moving through the routines of their education, aware in the specific way of adolescence that their parents' household was changing in ways that no one was explaining to them. Lee was increasingly in New York, where her social world was thickening around a new set of connections. Andy Warhol, Mick Jagger, the specific community of artists and socialites and cultural figures that New York in the early 1970s was assembling with its characteristic energy and its characteristic disregard for the social conventions that London still maintained. The New York world suited something in Lee that the London world had not fully accommodated. It was faster, louder, less organized around the careful maintenance of established position, and more organized around the production of novelty and the performance of relevance. It was a world in which what you were doing mattered more than what you were, which was, in principle, exactly what Lee had been looking for. In practice, what she was doing in New York in the early 1970s was largely being Lee Radziwill. Attending the right events, wearing the right things, being photographed at Studio 54 and at Warhol's factory, and at the kinds of dinners where the guest list was itself the statement. This was not nothing. The social performance she gave in New York during this period was, by all accounts, genuinely compelling. She was funny, she was perceptive, she had the specific quality of attention that makes people feel, in her presence, that the conversation they are having is the most interesting conversation happening anywhere. But it was, again, a performance of a life rather than a life, and the distance between the two was something that Lee was aware of with a precision that the performances themselves were designed, in part, to manage. The divorce from Stas Radziwill was finalized in 1974. Anthony was 15. Christina was 13. The title remained Barroso. She was still, and would remain, Princess Radziwill. But the marriage that had produced it, and the London household that had organized the first 15 years of her children's lives, was over. What came next would require Anthony and Christina to absorb another reorganization of the world they had grown up in, at an age when reorganization lands differently than it does in early childhood. When it is understood and felt and filed away in the specific ledger that adolescents keep of what the adults in their lives have done and what those actions mean about what can be relied upon. The ledger by 1974 already had entries. It was about to receive more. Stanisław Radziwill died in June of 1976, 2 years after the divorce was finalized. He died in London of a heart attack at the age of 62. He had been in declining health for several years before the end. His heart had been giving him trouble through the early 1970s, a fact that had been managed with the discretion that men of his generation and background applied to physical vulnerability, acknowledged in private and not discussed in public. He died in the city he had rebuilt himself in after the war, in the social world he had assembled from the ruins of a displaced aristocracy, and he died having been, for the last 2 years of his life, the former husband of a woman who had moved primarily to New York, and who was, by the time of his death, several years into a life organized around a different city and a different set of priorities. Anthony was 16 when his father died. Christina was 15. The death came 2 years after the divorce, which meant that Anthony and Christina had spent those 2 years in the specific condition of children whose family has formally separated, but whose world has not yet fully reorganized around the new shape. They had been living primarily in England, continuing their schooling, moving between their father's London life and the increasing pull of their mother's New York one, managing the transition with the competence that their upbringing had trained them to deploy and that concealed, as trained competence in adolescence generally does, the actual texture of what they were carrying. Their father's death closed a chapter in a way that the divorce had not quite closed it. Divorce leaves open the possibility of reconstruction, the theoretical option of a family that has changed shape but not ended. Death closes it entirely, and it closes it in the specific way that deaths of fathers close things for adolescent children, with a permanence that has no appeal process, no subsequent negotiation, no version of events in which the outcome changes. Stas Radziwill was 62, which is not old, and his children were 16 and 15, which is not old enough to have had the time with a father that would make his absence feel complete rather than interrupted. What they had had with him was limited by the same structural facts that had limited what they had with their mother. The social life, the adult priorities, the household infrastructure that substituted provision for presence. Stas had been, by the accounts of people who knew the family, warmer with his children than the austere image of European aristocratic fatherhood might suggest. He took them on trips. He was interested in them. He brought to his fatherhood the same quality of genuine engagement that he brought to everything, in the periodic and unstructured way of a man whose life was not organized around his children, but who, when he turned his attention toward them, turned it completely. What he had not been was there consistently in the way that children consolidate into their understanding of what reliable means. And now he was not there in a way that admitted no revision. Lee was in New York when Stas died, and she returned to London for the arrangements and the funeral. The accounts of people present describe her as composed and genuinely grieved. The relationship had ended in divorce, but it had also been 15 years of a shared life, a shared world, 2 children, and a particular kind of intimacy that does not dissolve entirely with a legal document. She managed the practical requirements with the efficiency she brought to practical requirements, and she was present for Anthony and Christina in the way she was present for difficult moments, focused, functional, and, by the accounts of people who were there, genuinely moved. Then she returned to New York. The phrase is not an accusation. New York was where her life was organized by 1976, where her social world was centered, where the career attempts and the social performances and the ongoing effort to construct a public identity that would satisfy whatever she was looking for were concentrated. Returning to New York was not abandonment. It was the continuation of a life that had been organized around New York for several years, and it was, in the vocabulary of her world and her time, the obvious, practical choice. What it meant for Anthony and Christina was that they navigated the first period of their grief, the weeks and months after their father's death, the specific unreality of a household from which the parental presence has been permanently removed. In England, without their mother's consistent presence, in the care of the people who had always cared for them when their parents were elsewhere. They were 16 and 15. They were, by every account, functional. They returned to their schools. They managed. The management was real, and it was also by the evidence of who they became and how they became it, costly in ways that did not immediately surface. The title remained. This is worth noting as a practical matter because the title was one of the things that the divorce and Stas's subsequent death reorganized in ways that had social consequences. Lee was Princess Radziwill by marriage, and she retained the form of a dress. It was hers in the social sense, if not in the strictly legal one. Anthony, as Stas's son, was Prince Radziwill in his own right. Christina was Princess Radziwill. The names had a weight in certain social environments that their bearers could use or ignore depending on the situation, and that they moved through with the practiced ease of people for whom the weight had always been there and who had therefore never had the experience of encountering it fresh. But the estate was complicated. Stas's property interests, the London houses that had been the foundation of his rebuilt fortune, required management, legal attention, the specific work of administering an estate across international jurisdictions. The details of this process and the financial outcomes it produced for Lee and for the children are not matters of full public record. What the accounts of people close to the family suggest is that the divorce settlement and the estate created a financial situation for Lee that was comfortable but considerably less expansive than the Radziwill marriage at its height had been, and that required her, for the first time in her adult life, to attend to money in a practical way that the infrastructure of wealthy marriages had previously made unnecessary. This is not to say she was in financial difficulty in any ordinary sense. She was not. But the specific freedom from financial consideration that comes from being inside a wealthy marriage, the freedom to pursue projects, to maintain households, to sustain the level of social performance that her world required without calculating its cost, was no longer entirely available. The New York apartment she maintained in the 1970s was on Fifth Avenue, but smaller than the one Jackie occupied a few blocks away. The social life she sustained was expensive, but managed with an attention to expense that had not been necessary before. The gap between what her life looked like and what it cost to maintain it was one that required ongoing management, and the management of that gap produced, over time, a quality of low-level financial anxiety that existed beneath the polished surface of everything she presented to the world. Anthony and Christina were in England through their secondary schooling, moving through the specific social world that English boarding schools produce. A world of connections and rituals and the carefully managed presentation of a self that their upbringing had prepared them for. Exactly. Anthony was, by the accounts of teachers and schoolmates who have spoken about him in the years since, a young man of genuine qualities. Warm, funny, possessed of the social ease that his background had produced, but also beneath it a seriousness about people and relationships that went beyond social ease into something more deliberate. He was interested in others. He remembered things people told him. He had the quality, relatively rare in the social world he moved through, of making people feel that his attention was genuine rather than performed. Christina was quieter in the accounts that survive her, less socially visible than her brother, more internally organized, with the specific reserve of someone who has learned to keep the more significant parts of themselves less available to the social world. She was close to Anthony with a consistency that the years had not eroded, and she was, by the accounts of people who knew her as an adolescent, navigating the particular difficulties of being Lee Radziwill's daughter, with a combination of grace and cost that she did not discuss openly. Being Lee Radziwill's daughter had specific contents. It meant moving through social environments in which your mother was always a reference point, always the person who organized the room's understanding of who you were before you had an opportunity to organize it yourself. It meant carrying a name that came with a history that was not your history, but that you were expected to inhabit. It meant being in certain social contexts primarily legible as an appendage of a woman whose primary public identity was itself primarily an appendage of another woman. The chain of reference, Christina, daughter of Lee, sister of Jackie, was not one that the social world Christina moved through was inclined to break, and navigating it required the same energy that navigating any inherited identity requires. The constant low-level work of establishing that you are a person rather than a position, that the specifics of who you are have some relevance independent of the context that preceded you. Lee was in New York, managing her social life and her design work, and the ongoing project of constructing an identity in a city that was moving fast enough to require constant attention. She called. She visited. She brought her children to New York in the summers and introduced them to the world she was building there, the Warhol world and the fashion world, and the specific community of people who inhabited the intersection of money and glamour that 1970s New York produced with such extraordinary intensity. The introductions were genuine acts of inclusion. Lee was not withholding her world from her children. She was sharing it with them in the specific way available to her, which was the way of a woman whose primary gift to the people she loved was access. Access to beautiful places, to interesting people, to the rooms where the most compelling conversations were happening. It was a real gift. It was also, for Anthony and Christina, a version of the same experience they had always had. Being present in their mother's world on their mother's terms, in the context of her priorities and her social obligations, in the role of the children of Lee Radziwill rather than simply themselves. By the late 1970s, Anthony was in his late teens and beginning to make his own way, considering what his adult life would look like, what work he would do, where he would live. He had the social connections of his background and the genuine warmth of his own character, and he was beginning to assemble, in the specific way of young men who have grown up in households organized around adult social life, a sense of who he was that was partly inherited and partly fought for. He was drawn to storytelling, to film and television, to the work of making things that other people watched and felt. It was, in its own register, not entirely unlike what his mother had attempted in the 1960s, and it was also, in the ways that matter, entirely unlike it because Anthony had something Lee had not had when she walked onto the Chicago stage. A genuine technical interest in the craft itself, not just in the recognition that the craft might provide. Christina was moving through her own version of the same process, with less visibility in the record and with the specific difficulty of being a young woman in a social world that organized its attention around her mother in a way that left less room for a daughter, who had not yet produced the kind of surface that the social world could organize itself around. Both of them were carrying into their adult lives the specific freight of a childhood that had been beautiful and unstable in equal measure, that had given them access to extraordinary things and withheld from them the specific ordinary thing that no amount of extraordinary access can substitute for: the reliable, daily, unperformed presence of parents who had organized their lives around their children rather than alongside them. The freight was not invisible, though it was managed with the composure that their upbringing had made second nature. It was there in the quality of the closeness between them, which remained the most consistent relationship in both their lives as they moved into adulthood. It was there in the particular way Anthony engaged with people, with the focused, genuine attentiveness of someone who had learned early that attention was something you could not take for granted. It was there in Christina's reserve, in the careful distance she maintained between her inner life and the social world that kept trying to read her primarily as her mother's daughter. The dismantling that the divorce and Stas's death had produced was not spectacular. It did not produce in Anthony or Christina the obvious damage that simpler accounts of difficult childhoods generate. It produced something quieter and more durable. A set of orientations toward the world, toward other people, toward the question of what can be relied upon, that had been shaped by a specific childhood in a specific household, and that would continue to shape, in ways neither of them could entirely see, the adult lives they were beginning to assemble. Lee, in New York, was assembling her own adult life. The post-marriage, post-London version of herself that the 1970s and 1980s would produce. She was assembling it with the energy and the intelligence and the genuine social gift that she had always had. And she was assembling it in a world that found her compelling and that remained, despite everything, slightly unclear about what exactly she was. By 1975, Lee Radziwill had been living primarily in New York for several years, and the city had absorbed her with the specific appetite it reserves for people who arrive with the right combination of beauty, connections, and the faint glamour of a life lived elsewhere at a high altitude. She was 42. She had a Fifth Avenue apartment, a social world that was reorganizing itself around the energies of a decade that was, in New York, producing a particular kind of cultural intensity. The Factory, Studio 54, the collision of old money and new art, and the specific community of people who understood that the most interesting rooms in the city were the ones where those two worlds overlapped. She moved through these rooms with the ease that 20 years of moving through the best rooms in London and Paris and Washington had produced, and she moved through them as herself, not as a wife, not as a sister, not as a title, which was both what she had been working toward and, in its own way, a new kind of exposure. The New York social world of the mid-1970s was not, despite its energy, a world that offered women of Lee's type a clearly legible role. London had offered the role of aristocratic hostess. Washington had offered the role of political adjacency. New York offered something less defined, a kind of perpetual social performance in which relevance was produced and consumed with extraordinary speed, and in which the currency of last season's connections depreciated faster than it did anywhere else she had lived. To remain interesting to New York in the way that Lee needed to remain interesting required a continuous investment of energy and attention and the specific kind of reinvention that the city rewarded, and that cost in the people who sustained it more than it visibly extracted. She sustained it. The photographs from this period show a woman who inhabited her own image with genuine conviction. The clothes, the hair, the quality of composed ease that she wore in every social setting, the specific way she occupied a room that photographers found compulsively interesting. She was, in the mid-1970s New York social world, genuinely compelling, and the compellingness was not entirely performance. It was also the product of a real intelligence and a real social gift operating in an environment that appreciated those qualities, even if it appreciated them primarily as attributes of a fascinating social presence rather than as evidence of something more substantial. The men she was involved with during the late 1970s and 1980s reflected the specific options available to a woman of her position in that world. There was Peter Tufo, a lawyer and Democratic Party figure, with whom she had a relationship of several years' duration in the mid-1970s. Tufo was substantive, a serious professional man with a real career and a genuine engagement with the political and civic life of New York. And the relationship was, by accounts of people who knew them both, a real one, not merely a social arrangement. It lasted several years and ended without the public drama that Lee's earlier circumstances had generated, which is to say that it ended in the ordinary way that relationships between people with complicated lives tend to end, and that the ending was managed with the composure that Lee brought to endings. Then there was Newton Cope, a San Francisco hotelier, and there were others. Men who moved through her life in the late 1970s and early 1980s with varying degrees of seriousness and varying durations, none of them producing the specific combination of social weight and personal stability that a third marriage would have required. Lee was not, by the evidence of the choices she was making, actively pursuing a third marriage. She was pursuing a life, a New York life, organized around her design work and her social world and the ongoing project of being Lee Radziwill in a city that found her interesting. And the men in that life were part of it without being its organizing principle. This was a different orientation than the one that had produced her first two marriages, both of which had been undertaken, whatever else they were, as structural decisions about what kind of life to build and in what social world to build it. The Canfield marriage had been a social expectation met. The Radziwill marriage had been a strategic repositioning toward a world that would give her more room. Neither had been, in the primary sense, organized around the man himself. The relationships of the New York years were organized differently. Or at least they appeared to be organized differently, which may be the more accurate way to put it, because the patterns that childhood installs in people's intimate lives do not typically reorganize themselves because the city changes. What the New York years produced, alongside the social life and the design work and the men who came and went, was a deepening of Lee's friendship with a specific group of people who became, in the absence of a stable domestic life, her primary emotional community. Andy Warhol was central to this community. His diaries, published after his death in 1987, contain hundreds of references to Lee across the late 1970s and 1980s, recording lunches and dinners and phone calls, and the specific texture of a friendship between two people who were both, in their different ways, engaged in the sustained performance of a public self. Warhol found Lee endlessly interesting and said so in the flat, observational way he said everything, noting her beauty and her wit and the quality of melancholy that he detected beneath her social surface, with the accuracy of someone who recognized it because he had his own version of it. Truman Capote was still in her life, though the friendship was complicated by Capote's deterioration through the late 1970s. The drinking, the drugs, the social self-destruction that produced the Answered Prayers excerpts in Esquire in 1975 and 1976, which named and thinly fictionalized enough of the social world Lee moved through to make their publication a small detonation in that world's carefully maintained surfaces. Capote had not written about Lee in a way that directly damaged her, but the excerpts damaged relationships throughout the community they shared, and the fallout, the social exclusions, the ended friendships, the specific atmosphere of betrayal that the pieces produced meant that Capote himself became, in the late 1970s, a more isolated figure, less able to function as the social connector and advocate he had been for Lee in the 1960s. He died in 1984 in the Los Angeles home of Joanna Carson, having spent his final years in a condition that people who had known him at his best found painful to witness. Lee was at his memorial. She spoke about him with the specificity of someone accounting for a real friendship rather than a social one, noting particular conversations, particular qualities, the specific way he had seen her that other people had not quite managed. Meanwhile, Anthony and Christina were moving through their 20s. Anthony had come to New York, but he drawn by the same pull that had drawn his mother, the city's energy, its creative world, its specific atmosphere of possibility. He had begun working in television production, starting at the level where people with no particular technical background but with intelligence and social ease and genuine curiosity begin. Assistant work, research, the accumulation of practical knowledge about how the medium functioned from the inside. He was in his early 20s, living in the city, building a life with the specific combination of inherited advantage and personal effort that his background made available. He was also during this period building his relationship with his mother on the terms that New York made possible. Proximity, shared social world, the specific kind of adult friendship between parents and children that can develop when both parties are living in the same city, and the pressures of childhood have been replaced by the more negotiable pressures of adult life. Lee and Anthony were genuinely close in the New York years, in a way that was different from the closeness available in childhood, when closeness had meant something different and cost something different. They had dinner, they talked about work. They moved through overlapping social worlds in a city that was big enough to give each of them room and small enough, at the level they both inhabited, to keep them in regular contact. Christina's trajectory was less centered on New York and less visible in the record that has survived the period. She was living in Europe for stretches of the early 1980s, and the accounts of her life during this time are thinner than the accounts of Anthony's, partly because she inhabited her world with less public visibility, and partly because the social world she moved through was less thoroughly documented than the New York one her mother and brother occupied. She was, by the accounts that do survive, continuing to navigate the specific difficulty of being the less visible child of a very visible woman in a world that organized its attention primarily around visibility. The question of what Christina made of her mother during this period, what she thought of the New York life, the men, the social performances, the design career that was real but bounded, the ongoing effort to be something specific in a world that kept receiving Lee as someone interesting without quite knowing what to do with her, is not something the record resolves. Christina was, by the accounts of people who knew her as a young adult, a person of real interior life and limited public expression, which meant that her relationship with her mother was experienced primarily inside her rather than narrated outside it. Lee, in the early 1980s, married for the third time. The marriage was to Herbert Ross, a film director and choreographer whose career, The Turning Point, Footloose, Steel Magnolias, gave him a genuine standing in the professional world of American entertainment that was entirely different from the social standings of the men Lee had previously been involved with. Ross was successful in the way that directors are successful, through the sustained production of work that the industry and the public responded to, through the accumulation of a professional reputation built on what he had made rather than who he was adjacent to. The marriage took place in 1988. Lee was 55. Ross was 62. It was the first of her marriages that was not, in any obvious structural sense, a repositioning, not a move toward a different social world or a different form of status. It was a marriage between two people who had, by their mid-50s, already done most of the positioning they were going to do and who were, in the straightforward sense, drawn to each other. It lasted until Ross's death in 2001, which means it outlasted both her previous marriages in duration and produced, in its 13 years, a quality of domestic stability that the earlier marriages had not provided. Lee was, by the accounts of people who knew them both, genuinely happy in the marriage, not in the performed way of someone inhabiting a successful social arrangement, but in the quieter way of someone who had found, later than expected, a version of the thing she had been looking for. But 1988 was still several years away from the point where this account is standing. In the early 1980s, Lee was in her late 40s, managing her New York life with the specific combination of genuine pleasure and ongoing effort that the city required, maintaining her relationships with Anthony and Christina in the specific ways that her life made available, and continuing to inhabit, with remarkable consistency, the pattern that her adult life had established. The pattern of a woman whose public presence was vivid and compelling, and whose inner life and whose relationships with the people closest to her were organized around a set of needs and blind spots that the social world she moved through was not equipped to address and that she herself had not yet found a way to fully see. Anthony, in his 20s, was watching his mother with the specific attention of a child who has grown up trying to understand a parent who was always slightly out of focus, too mobile, too socially complex, too thoroughly organized around her own priorities to be read with the straightforward clarity that children prefer. He loved her with the genuine, complicated love that such parents produce in their children, the love that is also, inseparably, a form of chronic low-level grievance that neither party can entirely name or resolve. Christina was watching from a somewhat greater distance, in the specific way of a person who has decided that distance is a form of protection and who has not yet been forced, by the specific event that would eventually force it, to decide whether the protection is worth what it costs. That event was coming. It was not yet visible in the early 1980s, but it was already present in the way that the things that change lives are always already present, in the biology, in the genetics, in the specific facts of a body that has not yet produced any evidence of what it is carrying. Anthony, in his 20s, was healthy. He was young, he was building his career and his adult relationships and his sense of himself with the energy of someone for whom the future is still entirely open. He had no reason to believe otherwise. He had no reason to believe otherwise for another decade. Anthony Radziwill was 33 years old in 1992 when he was first diagnosed with a soft tissue sarcoma, a rare and aggressive form of cancer that begins in the connective tissues of the body, and that, in Anthony's case, manifested in a way that his doctors described from the beginning with a candor that left little room for comfortable misreading. The diagnosis was not a warning. It was not an early detection that opened onto a straightforward treatment path. It was the beginning of a 7-year medical engagement with a disease that would prove, across those 7 years, to be exactly as serious as it had initially presented itself. He was, at the time of the diagnosis, working as a television producer. He had built, through his 20s, a genuine career in broadcast journalism and documentary production, working first at ABC News and then in roles that gave him increasing responsibility and increasing creative involvement in the work itself. He was good at it in the way that the people who worked with him described consistently and specifically. Not good in the general sense of someone who functions competently in a professional environment, but good in the particular sense of someone who understood what stories were for and how to construct them, who brought to the work a quality of attention and human interest that the people around him recognized as something more than professional skill. He had his mother's gift for making people feel seen, deployed in a medium that rewarded exactly that quality. He had also, by 1992, met the woman he would marry. Carol DiBenedetto was a model and television personality who had grown up in circumstances that were, in almost every external particular, different from Anthony's. She was from a working-class family in New Jersey, had built her career through her own effort in an industry that does not accommodate people who rely primarily on inherited advantage, and had arrived at the social world she now moved through by a route that had nothing to do with titles or family connections or the specific geography of privilege that had organized Anthony's entire childhood. She was warm, direct, and possessed of a quality of practical resilience that the social world Anthony came from tended to admire from a distance without entirely knowing how to accommodate up close. They had been together for several years before the diagnosis. The diagnosis did not end the relationship. It transformed it into something more serious and more load-bearing than the relationship of two young people in their early 30s might ordinarily have been, and it transformed it immediately with the specific efficiency of a serious illness that makes the questions people spend years circling suddenly unavoidable. The treatment began. Sarcomas of Anthony's type required surgery and then chemotherapy, and then the ongoing management of a body that had been subjected to both, and that was, in the years that followed, in a state of continuous medical negotiation between the disease and the treatments designed to address it. Anthony underwent multiple surgeries across the 7 years of his illness. The surgeries were not minor. They were extensive procedures that required long recoveries, that altered the physical landscape of his body in ways that had to be absorbed and adapted to, that produced in him, alongside the obvious physical consequences, the specific interior reorganization that serious illness produces in people who are confronted in their early 30s with a sustained possibility of their own death. He continued to work through much of his illness. This is worth establishing not as evidence of heroism in the inspirational sense, but as evidence of character in the more straightforward sense. He was a person for whom the work mattered, for whom the daily activity of doing the thing he was good at was not separable from the daily activity of being himself, and who understood with the clarity that illness can produce that the work was one of the things worth preserving as long as it could be preserved. He worked at ABC News and later at CNN, producing documentary work that his colleagues consistently described as among the best being done in the format. Lee was in New York when the diagnosis came, and she was present for the first period of it with the focused attention she brought to crises. Practically engaged, emotionally available in the specific way she was emotionally available, which was fully and genuinely, but also in ways that the accounts of people close to the situation described carefully within the boundaries of what she could sustain. She attended medical appointments. She was in contact with his doctors. She was, in the immediate period around the diagnosis and the first treatments, a present mother in a way that the structure of her previous years had not always made her. But illness of Anthony's duration and seriousness is not a crisis in the sense of a discrete event that requires a concentrated response and then resolves. It is a condition, a sustained years-long condition that requires a sustained response, that asks of the people around the ill person not a single focused act of presence, but a continuous, unglamorous, exhausting quality of showing up that is entirely different from the kind of presence that social life, with its events and occasions and defined moments, trains people to provide. Lee was good at the moments. The sustained, undramatic continuity was harder. The accounts of people close to Anthony during his illness describe a support structure that was assembled, as support structures generally are assembled around young people facing serious illness, from multiple sources: friends, colleagues, the medical teams. Carol, who became the primary constant in Anthony's daily life as the illness progressed, and family, in the complicated and varying degrees that family manages to provide. Lee was part of that structure. She was not, by the accounts that survive, the center of it. This is not an unusual distribution of caregiving in families with the specific history the Radzywills had. The years of distance, the peripatetic childhood, the adult relationship rebuilt in New York on terms that were warm and genuine, but not, in the structural sense, organized around dependence. Anthony had learned through the specific training of his childhood not to organize his life around his mother's reliable presence, and this learning had produced in his adult life a relationship with her that was real and affectionate and appropriately bounded. He did not expect from her the thing she had not, throughout his life, been able to provide, which meant that her presence, when it came, could be received as what it was, rather than measured against what it wasn't. Carol was different. Carol had not learned to bound her expectations of the people she loved. She had grown up in a household that expected people to show up for each other in the daily, undramatic, continuous way, and she brought this expectation to her relationship with Anthony with a consistency that was, in the accounts of people who witnessed it, genuinely extraordinary. She managed his medical appointments and his medications and his recoveries and the daily logistics of a life organized around a serious illness, and she did this while also maintaining her own career and her own life with a practical competence that the people around her found admirable, and that she herself, in the accounts she has given in the years since, describes as simply what you do when you love someone. She and Anthony married in 1994, 2 years after the diagnosis. The wedding was held in East Hampton on a summer day, and it was, by the accounts of people who were there, a genuine celebration, not the performed happiness of a social event, but the more specific happiness of two people who had chosen each other in full knowledge of what the choosing meant, who had been tested by circumstances that would have ended many relationships, and had found in the testing that the relationship was worth the test. Lee was present. Jackie was present. This was, in fact, one of the last significant family gatherings before Jackie's own death, which came in May of 1994, 2 months before the wedding. Jackie Kennedy Onassis died on May 19, 1994, of non-Hodgkin's lymphoma at her apartment on Fifth Avenue. She was 64. The death had been relatively swift. The diagnosis had come in January, and the 4 months between diagnosis and death had been managed in the Kennedy way, with considerable privacy and considerable control over what information reached the public and when. Lee was with her at the end, in the apartment on Fifth Avenue, in the rooms where Jackie had lived since her return from Greece after Onassis's death in 1975. The dynamic between the two sisters in Jackie's final months is not something the record addresses with any precision. What the record shows is presence. Lee was there, in the relevant sense, in a way that the years had not always produced. The complicated long history between them, the Onassis question, and the decades of managed comparison and the specific quality of a sisterhood lived in the context of an extraordinary imbalance of public attention. All of this existed in the room in some form, and none of it is recoverable from the outside with any honesty. What is recoverable is that Jackie died, and that her death reorganized the world around Lee in a way that Stas's death and the various other losses of her adult life had not quite managed to do. Jackie had been the fixed point against which Lee had navigated for most of her conscious life. The comparison, the shadow, the reference, the sister. With Jackie gone, there was no longer a fixed point of that particular type, and what that meant for Lee's sense of herself, and for her ongoing project of understanding what she was when she was not being understood in relation to her sister, was something that the years following 1994 would slowly reveal. But in the summer of 1994, what was most immediately present was Anthony's wedding, and Anthony's illness, and the specific quality of attention that the illness had begun to produce in the family around it. The heightened awareness of time, the particular way that people move toward each other when one of them is facing something that cannot be managed through social performance or strategic positioning or any of the other tools that their shared background had provided. The illness had, by the time of the wedding, been present for 2 years. It had been treated and managed and had not resolved. The sarcoma was the kind of disease that the medical world of the early 1990s could address with considerable technical sophistication without being able to cure. Could suppress, could monitor, could operate on repeatedly with increasing precision without being able to eliminate the underlying condition that kept requiring suppression and monitoring and operation. Anthony knew this. Carol knew this. Lee knew this. The wedding happened in the context of this knowledge, and the happiness of it was genuine and was also in the specific way of happiness that occurs in the presence of serious illness, edged with the awareness of what the happiness was being asserted against. The years between the wedding and what was coming were years of treatment and remission and recurrence and further treatment. The specific rhythm of a serious illness that does not move in a straight line, but that moves across sufficient time, consistently in one direction. Anthony worked. He and Carol lived in their apartment in New York. He saw his mother. He maintained, with the energy of someone who has decided that the maintenance of ordinary life is itself a form of resistance, the texture of the adult life he had built. The cousin who became his closest friend during this period was John F. Kennedy, Jr., Jackie's son, 3 years older than Anthony, a man who had grown up in the specific goldfish bowl of American Kennedy mythology, and who had by his early 30s developed a relationship with his own public identity that was, in its management of attention and expectation, not entirely unlike what Anthony had been doing all his life on a smaller scale. They had known each other since childhood, in the way of cousins whose family gatherings were significant events and whose shared history included the particular weight of the Kennedy assassination and everything it had done to the family around it. In adulthood, they had become something more than cousins, genuinely close friends, the kind of friends who choose each other rather than simply inheriting each other. John knew about Anthony's illness and its seriousness, and his presence in Anthony's life during the years of treatment was, by the accounts of people close to both men, one of the more sustaining elements of Anthony's daily reality. They spoke regularly. They saw each other. They had the specific relationship of two people who understood each other's worlds from the inside. The inherited attention, the family mythology, the particular quality of being known primarily in relation to something larger than yourself, and who had found in each other someone for whom that understanding did not require explanation. Lee watched this friendship with the awareness of someone who recognized in the closeness between her son and his cousin something that she had not been able to provide, and that Anthony had found elsewhere, as children who do not find it at home generally manage to find it, in the specific human connection that fills the space that the absent or insufficient parent leaves behind. She did not say this. It is not in any record. It is the kind of thing that is felt rather than said in families where feeling and saying have a complicated relationship, in women who have spent their lives managing the distance between what they experience and what they allow to show. Anthony, in the late 1990s, was 36, 37, 38, still working, still present, still the person his colleagues and friends describe with the consistent warmth that suggests a man who had developed, partly through the specific pressures of his childhood and partly through the specific pressures of his illness, a quality of genuine human engagement that was one of the more valuable things his particular life had produced. He was also, through those same years, getting sicker. John F. Kennedy Jr. died on July 16, 1999, when the small plane he was piloting went down in the waters off Martha's Vineyard. He was 38 years old. His wife, Carolyn Bessette Kennedy, and her sister, Lauren Bessette, were on board. There were no survivors. The search for the wreckage took several days, and those days were conducted in the full and relentless attention of the American press, which treated the disappearance and then the confirmed deaths with the specific intensity that the Kennedy name had always generated, and that John Jr., despite his genuine efforts to live a life of reasonable privacy, had never entirely been able to escape. Anthony Radziwill was dying when his cousin's plane went down. He had been admitted to a hospital in New York in the weeks before July 16th, and the admission was not the kind that carries the possibility of discharge in the near term. The sarcoma that had been managed and treated and monitored and operated on across 7 years had reached a point in its progression that the medical management could no longer meaningfully address. He was 39 years old. He had been ill for 7 years. The illness had taken from him, in increments across those 7 years, portions of his physical capacity, the ability to move through the world with the ease of a healthy body, the energy for sustained work, the ordinary daily freedom from pain that people who have never been seriously ill understand as simply the background condition of being alive. What it had not taken by the accounts of the people who were with him through the final weeks was the quality of attention and presence that had always been the most recognizable thing about him. He was, in the specific way of people who are dying and who have had sufficient time to understand that they are dying, more concentrated rather than less, more precisely himself, more directly engaged with the people around him, less interested in the management of surfaces that the social world he had grown up in had trained him to maintain. Carol was with him. She had been with him in the continuous and unglamorous and genuinely loving way she had been with him throughout his illness. And the final weeks were the most concentrated version of a presence she had sustained for 7 years. The accounts of people who were at the hospital during this period describe a woman who had organized her entire existence around the person in the hospital bed with a completeness and consistency that the people who witnessed it found, depending on their own relationship to that kind of love, either overwhelming or clarifying or both. Lee was there. She was in and out of the hospital in the weeks before Anthony's death, present in the specific way that she was present for the worst moments, focused, practically engaged, genuinely available within the limits of what she could sustain. The people who were at the hospital during this period describe her presence with a care that suggests both that it was real and that it was bounded, that she came, that she sat with him, that she was moved in ways she did not entirely conceal, and that she also left, returned to her apartment, managed the practicalities of her own life in the city, and came back. This is what presence looks like for most people in situations of prolonged dying. The visits, the departures, the return. It is not a failure of love, but in the specific context of a dying man whose mother had been throughout his life a figure of brilliant intermittent presence rather than continuous availability, the intermittency registered differently than it might have in a different relationship with a different history. John's death on July 16th happened while Anthony was in the hospital, while Anthony was himself dying. The news came to Anthony through the people around him. Carol, the hospital staff, the relatives and friends who were moving in and out of his room. And the accounts of what it produced in him are among the most painful details in the record of these weeks. He was, by those accounts, devastated in the way that people are devastated when they have already given up a great deal and are then asked to give up something more, when the reservoir that the illness has been drawing on for 7 years is asked to absorb an additional loss that arrives without warning and without the preparation that at least the long dying provides. John Kennedy Jr. had been, in the specific emotional vocabulary of Anthony's adult life, the person who understood him most completely, who shared the particular experience of growing up in the shadow of an enormous family mythology, who had chosen Anthony as a friend rather than simply inherited him as a cousin, who had been present throughout the illness with the consistency that Anthony recognized and valued precisely because consistency had not been the organizing principle of his childhood. To lose John, to have John taken suddenly and completely, while Anthony himself was in the process of a more gradual and more anticipated departure, was a loss that had no available framework, that arrived in a situation already organized around the management of the unmanageable and asked to be absorbed without any of the ordinary resources for absorption. The public grief for John Kennedy Jr. was enormous, as it always was for Kennedy deaths, as it had been trained to be enormous by 60 years of the American press treating the Kennedy family as a kind of national mythology whose losses were collective rather than private. The coverage was continuous. The images of the search for the wreckage were broadcast without interruption. The reactions of public figures and ordinary people were solicited and published and discussed with the specific intimacy that celebrity grief produces. The sense that a private loss has become, through the alchemy of fame, a loss that belongs to everyone who was paying attention. Anthony was dying in a hospital room while all of this was happening. He was not the subject of the coverage. He was not, in the public reckoning with the Kennedy losses of that summer, a figure whose own approaching death was part of the story being told. He was the sick cousin, the Polish prince's son, the peripheral figure, present in the family, not present in the mythology. He died on August 10, 1999, 25 days after John Kennedy Jr. He was 39 years old. He had been ill for 7 years. He died in New York with Carol beside him. Lee was there at his death. The accounts of the people present describe her grief as genuine and unmanaged, not the composed grief that she had brought to other losses, not the controlled presentation that social training produces in people who have learned to manage what they show, but something rawer and less mediated, the grief of a mother for a child, which is a different register from any other grief which does not respond to the management techniques that other losses allow. The funeral was held at St. Ignatius Loyola Church on Park Avenue, the same church where Jackie Kennedy Onassis's funeral had been held 5 years earlier. The coincidence of location produced, in the people who noticed it, a quality of observation about the Radziwill family's relationship to loss and to the specific geography of Upper East Side Catholic grief that the social world they moved through had established across decades. Lee sat in the front pew. She was 66 years old. She had buried her sister 5 years earlier, her former husband 23 years earlier, and now her son. The eulogies were given by people who had known Anthony well, colleagues from his professional life, friends from his adult years. People who described the specific qualities that the people around him had consistently identified: the warmth, the genuine interest, the quality of attention that made people feel that they were worth attending to. The eulogies were for a man who was, by the evidence of those who gave them, genuinely loved in the specific way that requires actually knowing a person, not just admiring their surface. Carol spoke. Her account of her husband was precise and direct, and without the social performance that the occasion and the company might have invited. She spoke about who he was in the daily texture of a life shared, which is the most honest kind of account, and the one that the social world that attended the funeral, trained as it was to receive and produce more stylized forms of tribute, received with the particular attention of people encountering something less managed than they were accustomed to. Lee did not speak at the funeral. Whether this was a choice made out of the specific incapacity of a grief that had exceeded her management capacity, or whether it was a choice made for other reasons, the record does not say. She sat in the front pew and received the condolences of the people who came to offer them, the social world she had moved through for 40 years, The family members and the public figures and the friends who assembled at St. Ignatius Loyola on a summer day to mark the end of a 39-year life. The months that followed Anthony's death were, by the accounts of people who saw Lee during this period, the most visibly difficult period of her adult life. Not the most dramatically difficult. There had been moments of sharper public crisis, the Onassis situation and the divorce and the various professional failures that had been managed with composed surfaces and the wit that never entirely deserted her. This was different. This was a grief that did not respond to the social tools available to her, that could not be absorbed into a narrative of resilience or redirected into social activity or managed through the production of a more interesting self. She was, in the period after Anthony's death, less present in the social world she had inhabited. The dinners and the events and the steady performance of a New York life organized around being interesting. All of this continued, because the social world continues regardless of what it costs the people inside it. But it continued at a reduced intensity, with less of the specific energy that Lee's presence in a room had always produced. Herbert Ross, her husband since 1988, was with her through this period. The marriage had been, by the accounts of people who knew them both, a genuinely stable and sustaining thing. Not the performed happiness of a social arrangement, but the quieter reality of two people who had found each other late enough to know what they were finding. Ross's presence in the years after Anthony's death provided a form of continuity and support that the earlier years of her life, organized as they were around the intermittency of other people's presence, had not often produced. He was there, he was consistent, he did not leave. He died in 2001, 2 years after Anthony. He had been in declining health for some time, and his death was not sudden in the way that John Kennedy Jr.'s had been, but it was a loss that arrived in the specific aftermath of Anthony's death, in the particular landscape of a woman in her late 60s who was assembling, with the accumulating evidence of the years, an understanding of what remained. Christina had been present through the final period of Anthony's illness and at the funeral. She was 38 when her brother died, and the loss produced in her, by the accounts of people who knew her, a reorganization of her world that went deeper than the observable surface. She had lost, in Anthony, the person who had been the most consistent presence in her life since childhood. The one relationship that had not been subject to the complications of the Radziwill family's particular patterns of availability and absence. The one person who had chosen her without qualification and without the various conditions that the other relationships in her life had carried. What she did with that loss and what it meant for her relationship with Lee in the years that followed was something that the record of this period registers primarily through absence, through what was not said, what was not done, what slowly became the shape of a distance that neither party seems to have known how to close. Lee was 66 in 1999, and the year had taken from her in the space of a few summer weeks her son and her nephew, the two young men who had represented the specific future that wealthy families construct their sense of legacy around. The future had reorganized itself, abruptly and completely, into a shape that no amount of social intelligence or composed surfaces or practiced management of appearances could help her navigate. The houses were still beautiful. The clothes were still right. The wit was still intact, by the accounts of people who saw her in the years that followed. Something else was gone, not the performance of it, which continued, but the thing that the performance had always been protecting, the specific certainty that the future contained enough time and enough room to eventually produce what the past had not managed to provide. Christina Radziwill did not give many interviews. This is itself a kind of information in a social world where the children of famous women are generally either absorbed into the family's public narrative or defined by their rejection of it, and where the absence of public statement tends to be read by the people who track these things as evidence of one of two conditions: either a life sufficiently private to have escaped the machinery of public attention, or a life sufficiently complicated to have made engagement with that machinery inadvisable. Christina's silence was, by the evidence of what surrounded it, closer to the second of these. She had grown up in the specific condition of being the less visible child of an already secondary woman, which produced a kind of double remove from the center of attention that the family's public life was organized around. Jackie was the center. Lee was the sister. Christina was the sister's daughter, a position that, in the social world, the Radzywills moved through, carried the family name and the family associations without carrying the specific charge of either of the two women whose lives gave those associations their meaning. She was known in the sense that people in certain social circles knew who she was, without being known in the sense of having generated through her own actions and choices a public identity that others had engaged with on its own terms. This double remove had consequences for how Christina navigated the social world she had been born into. She did not, in the way of some children of famous families, attempt to leverage her inheritance into a public platform, did not seek the press attention that her name could have generated, did not cultivate the social visibility that her mother had spent decades pursuing, did not appear at the events and in the columns and on the guest lists that would have kept her name circulating in the specific world her family had always occupied. She moved through that world with a discretion that looked, from the outside, like either genuine preference or deliberate withdrawal, and that was almost certainly both. The relationship with Lee in the years following Anthony's death in 1999 is the central question of Christina's adult story, and it is a question that the record addresses primarily through the accounts of people who knew one or both of them during this period. Accounts that are, by necessity, partial and filtered, and that produce, when assembled, not a clear picture, but a set of consistent impressions that gesture towards something real without being able to name it with precision. What those accounts describe is a distance, not the ordinary distance of an adult child living a life separate from her parent. That is a normal condition and does not require explanation. What they describe is a distance of a different quality, one that had accumulated across the years rather than been established by a single event, and that had become, by the early 2000s, something more structural than circumstantial. Christina was not, by these accounts, present in Lee's daily life in the way that would have been possible, given that both women were in New York for significant portions of the year. She was not present in the way that Anthony had been present. The dinners, the calls, the overlapping social worlds, the specific adult friendship between parent and child that proximity and genuine affection make available. The absence was noticed by people in Lee's social world, though it was noticed with the discretion that that world applies to the private difficulties of its members. Noted, discussed quietly, not addressed. Lee did not discuss it publicly. She did not, in the accounts of friends who spoke with her about her children in the years after Anthony's death, address the question of Christina's absence in terms that would have allowed the subject to be examined directly. She managed the topic with the composure she brought to everything that cost her something, which meant that she acknowledged it in ways that were just sufficient to prevent denial while keeping the actual content of it protected from the social world's examination. What had produced the distance is not something the record resolves clearly. The accounts of people who knew Christina as an adult are consistent in describing a woman who had specific and considered feelings about her childhood, about the mobility, the absences, the particular way the Radziwill household had been organized around adult social priorities, and who had processed those feelings with the deliberateness of someone who had given them serious thought rather than simply reacting to them. She was not, by these accounts, someone who had arrived at her position through an accumulation of unexamined grievances. She was someone who had looked at the childhood she had been given and the mother who had given it to her and arrived at a set of conclusions that were, in her own assessment, accurate. The accuracy is what made it difficult to address. Grievances that are based on misunderstanding can be corrected. Grievances that are based on accurate perception of what actually happened require a different response, one that involves acknowledgement rather than correction, that asks the person who caused the hurt to see it as it was rather than explain it away. That is a much harder conversation, and it is a conversation that the Radziwill family's specific history of managing difficult things through performance rather than confrontation was not well equipped to produce. Lee was, by the accounts of the people close to her in the 2000s, aware that something had gone wrong between herself and Christina. The awareness did not produce in the record a direct engagement with what had gone wrong. It produced instead the specific quality of hurt that parents experience when their children withdraw. A hurt that is real, and that also, in people with the capacity for honest self-examination, carries within it some acknowledgement of the choices that preceded the withdrawal, though that acknowledgement is rarely available to be expressed cleanly in a single conversation. There were contacts. The accounts of people who knew both women suggest that there were occasional dinners, occasional phone calls, the maintenance of a minimal social connection that prevented the distance from becoming a formal rupture. Christina appeared at Lee's events sometimes. Lee acknowledged Christina's existence in the ways available to her, birthdays, the ordinary gestures of family connection that continue even when the connection itself has become more formal than genuine. But the texture of what had once been available, the kind of relationship that Anthony had rebuilt with Lee in New York, the adult friendship that proximity and genuine mutual interest can produce between parents and children who have managed to find each other on more equal terms, was not, by the evidence of what surrounded it, present between Lee and Christina in the years after Anthony's death. Christina had married in 2003. Her husband was Robert B.F. Kennedy Jr., not the politician of that name, but a different Robert Kennedy, a man outside the specific Kennedy and Radziwill social worlds that had organized her childhood, which may itself be a form of information about what she was looking for in an adult life. The marriage produced children, which meant that Lee became a grandmother, a role that the social world she moved through received with its customary attention to the symbolic dimensions of family milestones, and that Lee herself occupied with what the accounts of the period describe as genuine pleasure, the specific pleasure of grandchildren that does not require the daily sustained presence that children require, and that Lee had always found difficult to provide. The pleasure was real, and it was also in the specific way of things that arrive late, and are therefore received with a heightened awareness of their lateness, colored by the awareness of what had not been present earlier, what Anthony had not lived to see, what the relationship with Christina had not produced in the years when it might have been easier to produce it. The accounts of Lee as a grandmother are among the warmer in the record of her later years. She was, by the people who observed her with Christina's children, genuinely engaged in a way that was less complicated by the specific pressures of her own social world and her own ongoing projects of self-construction than her engagement with her own children had been. Children's time operates on a different frequency from adult social time. It does not require the performance of relevance or the management of a social identity. It requires presence of a simpler and more specific kind. Attention, play, the willingness to be in the moment that a child is in rather than the moment that the adult social world is in. Lee, in her 70s, was more available to that kind of presence than she had been in her 40s and 50s. The social world had contracted around her as it contracts around everyone in their 70s. Not through rejection, but through the natural thinning that age produces, the deaths and departures that reduce the cast of a social life to its more essential elements. The energy available for the production and maintenance of a public identity was less than it had been. The urgency of the project was less than it had been. What remained underneath the project was something that had always been there, and that the project had, for decades, been organized partly around a need for acknowledgement that was simpler and more fundamental than the social world could address, a need that had its origin in a household on Park Avenue, where two girls had learned very early that the attention available to them was limited and comparative and conditional, in ways that the social performances they were trained to give were designed to manage, but had never been able to fill. Christina understood this. She understood it with the specific clarity of someone who had grown up inside the same dynamic that had produced her mother and had had the particular vantage point of watching it from the child's position rather than from the adult one. She had seen, across her childhood and adolescence, a woman who was genuinely loving and genuinely incapable of making that love the organizing principle of her life, who had given her children beautiful houses and good schools and access to extraordinary worlds, and withheld from them, not through malice but through a specific kind of blindness, the thing that none of those provisions could substitute for. The blindness was not, Christina seems to have concluded, something that would be corrected by conversation. It was structural. Part of the way Lee had been built in the Bouvier household and the Auchincloss household, and the long training in social performance that those households had provided, and not something that the arrival of grandchildren, or the deaths of sons, or the accumulation of years was going to dismantle. Lee was who she was. Christina had concluded with the deliberateness of someone who has thought carefully about what to do with that conclusion, that the most honest response to who Lee was involved a degree of distance, not as punishment, not as formal estrangement, but as the simple acknowledgement that some distances are the accurate expression of what actually exists between people rather than the distortion of it. The question this raises, whether Christina's distance was correct, whether the judgment embedded in it was fair, whether the childhood she had experienced was as inadequate as her response to it implied, is not one that the record is equipped to answer. The record contains Lee's public life and its consequences, not the interior life of either woman, and the interior life is where the truth of these questions lives. What the record contains is the shape of a relationship, a mother and a daughter who were in the same city, who maintained the minimum connection that family requires, who did not, in the years available to them, find their way to the conversation that would have been required to change the shape of what existed between them. This is not an unusual outcome. It is, in fact, one of the more common outcomes in families where the damage is old enough and subtle enough to have been absorbed into the background of both parties' understanding of themselves and each other, where the cost of the conversation required to address it seems, to both parties, to exceed the likely benefit. But it is in the specific context of Lee Radziwill's life and what that life had been organized around, a particular kind of outcome. She had spent 60 years in pursuit of a specific form of recognition, the acknowledgement that she was herself sufficient, that her own qualities were worth attending to, independent of the women and the titles and the social worlds that had organized other people's attention toward her. She had pursued this recognition through marriages and careers and social performances and the careful assembly of beautiful rooms, and she had found it in varying degrees and with varying durations in many of the places she had looked, the one place where that recognition would have meant the most. From a daughter who had seen her clearly and without the filter of social performance, and who had chosen, on the basis of what she had seen, to acknowledge her fully, was the place where it had not arrived. Whether it could have arrived under different circumstances with different choices made earlier is the kind of question that the accumulation of years makes unanswerable in any useful sense. Christina was in her 40s in the years this account is describing, managing her own life with a privacy that had become, over the years, something she was clearly committed to. Not as a reaction against her mother's public visibility, but as a considered orientation toward the world that reflected what she had concluded about the relationship between visibility and cost. She had seen, at close range, across the entirety of her childhood and most of her adult life, what the pursuit of public recognition produced in the person who pursued it. She had drawn her own conclusions. Lee was in her 70s, and the social world was contracting, and the project that had organized most of her adult life was becoming, with the accumulation of years and losses and the specific clarity that late life produces in people who have sufficient honesty to use it, less urgent and less clearly the right project to have spent so much time on. Anthony was gone. Jackie was gone. Truman was gone. Warhol was gone. Herbert Ross was gone. The rooms that had once been full of the specific people who had made those rooms worth being in were filling now, with different people and a different quality of time. Slower, less pressured, organized less around the production of a self that the social world would recognize, and more around the simpler management of days. The distance between Lee and Christina persisted through this period, maintained with the specific consistency of something that has become a settled condition rather than an ongoing crisis. It was not dramatic. It was not, in the way of the most painful family estrangements, characterized by specific ruptures or public confrontations, or the kind of events that produce clear narratives of cause and effect. It was quiet, in the way that the most durable distances tend to be quiet, present without announcement, maintained without effort, simply the shape of the thing that had developed between two people who had never found the means or the moment to make it into something else. Lee moved through her later years with the shape of this distance as part of the background of her life, noted, felt, managed with the composure that had always been both her most reliable tool and the quality that made certain things impossible to address. She was in her 70s and 80s, still recognizably herself, still possessed of the wit and the eye and the social intelligence that had always been her most genuine qualities. She had outlasted most of the world that had made her who she was. What remained, underneath the long performance of a specific kind of life, was a woman who had given her children what she had been given: the beautiful surfaces, the access, the careful provision of everything material, and had withheld, not through intention, but through the deep training of her own childhood, the thing that neither beautiful surfaces nor careful provision can replace. Christina knew this. Whether she had found a way to hold it without letting it determine everything was a question that only she could answer, and she had answered it, consistently and without public explanation, with the distance that the years had produced and maintained. There is a quality that late life produces in people who have spent most of their adult years in motion, a quality not of stillness exactly, but of a slowing that is different from rest, that has in it the specific texture of a person becoming aware, with increasing concreteness, of the distance between where they have arrived and where they had, across all the decades of moving, assumed they were heading. Lee Radziwill entered her 70s in the early 2000s, with this quality beginning to organize itself around the edges of a life that was still, in its external arrangements, recognizably the life she had been living for 40 years. The New York apartment, the social engagements, the clothes that remained exactly right, the wit that had not dimmed in the way that some qualities dim with age, but had instead become more concentrated, more precise, carrying more weight per word than it had in the years when there were more words available and more time to spend them. Herbert Ross's death in 2001 removed the last domestic structure from her life. She had been married 3 times, and each marriage had provided, whatever else it provided, a household, a context, a shared daily life, the ordinary infrastructure of 2 people whose lives were formally joined. The Canfield marriage had provided it briefly and inadequately. The Radziwill marriage had provided it for 15 years, with the complications that 15 years of a difficult marriage produce. The Ross marriage had provided it for 13 years and had provided it well, in the specific way of a late marriage between 2 people who knew enough about what marriages cost to appreciate one that was genuinely working. With Ross's death, the household was hers alone, and the aloneness was of a different quality from the aloneness of the various periods between marriages. Not temporary, not the condition of someone between structures, but the permanent condition of someone whose structures had run out. She maintained the Fifth Avenue apartment. It was, by the accounts of people who visited her there during the 2000s, a beautiful space, Mongiardino's influence still present in the layered warmth of it, the objects arranged with the eye that had always been one of her genuine gifts, the specific atmosphere of a room that has been inhabited by a person of real aesthetic intelligence for long enough to carry the imprint of that intelligence in every surface. People who came to that apartment in Lee's later years describe it with the specific precision that beautiful interiors produce in people who are paying attention. The colors, the light, the quality of being somewhere that felt completely considered without feeling arranged for effect. It was in its way one of the most sustained and successful expressions of who Lee Radziwill actually was. More honest than any of the public performances, more completely hers than any of the social worlds she had moved through. But apartments, however beautiful, do not substitute for the people who once filled the social world around them. And the social world that had organized Lee's life for 4 decades was contracting in the specific and irreversible way that comes from outliving the people who composed it. The losses had accumulated across the 1980s and 1990s with increasing speed. Capote in 1984, Warhol in 1987, Jackie in 1994, Anthony in 1999, Ross in 2001. Each death removed not just a person, but a web of connection, a particular kind of conversation, a specific register of shared history that could not be replicated with new people, because new people had not been there for the beginning of it. The social world that remained was populated by people who knew Lee, who admired her, who found her compelling, but who had not known her in 1963 or 1968 or 1975, who had not been present for the events that had shaped whatever she was, who received her as the finished product rather than the process. This is the specific loneliness of surviving the people who knew you when you were still becoming yourself, and it is a loneliness that no social performance, however skilled, entirely addresses. Lee was in her 70s, still performing, still attending events, still appearing in the photographs that the social world takes of itself, still wearing the right things and saying the right things in the rooms where the right things were said. But the performance was addressing itself, increasingly, to an audience that did not have the context to receive it fully, and the gap between what Lee was offering and what the available audience could receive had widened with each passing year. The memoir she had been working on for years remained unfinished. This is a fact that people who discuss her later life mention with a consistency that suggests it registered as significant to the people around her. She had been described as working on a memoir, or as intending to work on a memoir. For most of the 1990s and 2000s, it was the project that kept being announced and deferred, the book that was always described as forthcoming, and that did not, in Lee's lifetime, arrive. The reasons for its non-arrival are not entirely in the public record, but the accounts of people who discussed it with her suggest a combination of factors that, taken together, produce a picture of someone who understood at some level that the book she wanted to write and the book she was able to write were not the same book. The book she wanted to write was presumably the book that a woman of her experience and intelligence and genuine literary sensibility could produce, a book that engaged honestly with the extraordinary world she had moved through and the extraordinary people she had known and the specific quality of a life lived at the intersection of beauty and privilege and the particular costs that beauty and privilege exact. It was a book that, if it were honest, would have required her to say things about Jackie, about Onassis, about her marriages, about her children, that the social world she still moved through and the image she still maintained would have made impossible to say. It was a book that would have required her to be on the page more transparent than she had ever been in a room full of people, and the room full of people was still, in some sense, always present. The book she was able to write, the book that would have stayed within the bounds of what could be said without cost, that would have produced the charming, curated, socially acceptable version of a remarkable life, was presumably not the book that satisfied whatever she was looking for when she sat down to write. The tension between these two books and the impossibility of resolving it may account for the years of deferral more fully than any practical explanation. She gave interviews, not many, and not ones that opened the internal rooms she had spent her life managing carefully. The interviews from her later years are, in their texture, performances of a specific kind, intelligent, witty, possessed of the quality of surface that Lee had always been able to produce in social situations, but organized around the management of exactly the kind of disclosure that would have made them genuinely revealing. She spoke about her taste, her friendships, her memories of people and places. She did not speak, in any sustained way, about the things that the documentary record of her life suggests had been its most significant contents. There was a public life still. She attended fashion events. She had remained, across the decades, a figure in the fashion world, someone whose relationship to clothes was understood as expressive rather than merely decorative, and the fashion world maintained its interest in her, with a consistency that reflected both genuine admiration and the specific appeal of someone whose style had been coherent and considered across 60 years of social change. She appeared at the kinds of cultural events that New York produces with its reliable energy. Gallery openings, benefit dinners. The occasions where the intersection of money and cultural life generates the specific atmosphere that the social world Lee had always occupied, recognized as its natural habitat. She was, by the accounts of people who encountered her at these events during the 2000s and 2010s, still compelling in the room, still possessed of the quality of attention that had always made her presence felt, still capable of the specific social intimacy that made people in her company feel that they were being genuinely seen. The wit remained. The eye remained. The quality of being somewhere entirely on purpose, of occupying a room with the complete conviction that it was worth occupying, remained. What the room could not see, And what the accounts of people close to her during this period suggest was increasingly present was the specific weight of the accumulation, the deaths, the distance with Christina, the unfinished memoir, the career attempts that had not produced what they were reaching for, the marriage to Onassis that Jackie had made and that had reorganized Lee's world in ways that had never been fully acknowledged between them, and that could not be acknowledged now because Jackie was gone. There were things that had not been said and could not now be said because the person they needed to be said to was no longer available. And this is a particular kind of incompleteness that late life makes permanently visible. Not as crisis, not as active wound, but as the simple fact of a door that is closed and will not open again. Lee had not said to Jackie whatever she needed to say about 1968 and Onassis and the specific quality of the wound that had required, for 40 years, such consistent and skilled management. Whether saying it would have changed anything is a question that cannot be answered. What is certain is that it had not been said, and that the not saying had become, with Jackie's death, a permanent condition rather than a deferred possibility. The apartment on Fifth Avenue became smaller in the later years. Not literally, but in the specific way that spaces become smaller when the social world that once filled them has contracted beyond a certain point. Lee moved at some point in the 2000s to a smaller apartment in Paris, which represented, in the geography of her life, a kind of return to the city she had first found compelling in 1951, to the European world that had always offered her a different quality of reception than New York, to a context where the American Kennedy mythology that had organized so much of her public identity carried less immediate weight, and where she could be, in some approximation, simply herself. Paris in her 80s was quieter than the life she had lived in it in the 1960s. The social world available to her there was smaller and less intense, organized around a different rhythm than the one that had always characterized her engagement with the city when she was moving through it as a younger woman at the height of whatever she had been at the height of. She had friends there, old ones. The specific kind of friendship that survives decades because it was built on something more durable than social proximity. She had the city itself, which had not changed in the ways that mattered, the light, the architecture, the specific quality of Parisian social life that had appealed to her since she was 18 years old and had found, in the streets of a city recovering from occupation, something that felt more calibrated to her sensibility than anything she had found at home. Christina was not in Paris. The distance between them continued in the specific form it had taken. Minimal contact, the maintenance of a connection that fell short of relationship in the full sense, but that did not entirely disappear. Lee was in her 80s. Christina was in her 50s. The window in which the conversation that might have changed things could have happened had not closed in any absolute sense. Windows of that kind close only with death. But it had become, with the years, a window that neither party was moving toward with any urgency. The grandchildren were in the picture in the ways available, visits, occasions, the specific pleasure that Lee took in them, which was real and which represented, in its uncomplicated warmth, something that the more loaded relationships in her life had not always been able to produce. The grandchildren did not have the history. They did not carry the specific freight of a childhood that had been given and received in the complicated way that Lee's parenting had been given and received. They were simply, in the moments available with them, people whose company she enjoyed, and the enjoyment was unclouded by the weight of what preceded it. She gave a final significant interview in 2016 for a publication whose interest in her was organized primarily around her relationship to Jackie and to the Kennedy years. As most of the interviews she gave across her adult life were organized. She was 82. She was, in the photographs from the interview, still immediately recognizable as herself. The specific quality of presence that had organized other people's attention toward her, since she was a young woman, was still there, not diminished but distilled, carrying more weight in less space. She spoke about her taste. She spoke about the people she had known. She managed the territory of what could be said with the skill of someone who had been doing it for 60 years. She did not speak about Anthony in a way that opened the subject. She did not speak about Christina. She did not speak about Onassis and Jackie in a way that acknowledged what that situation had cost her. She spoke about the world she had moved through, and about the beauty she had found in it, and about the specific pleasure she took in the things that her eye had always responded to. The light in certain rooms, the texture of certain fabrics, the quality of conversation in certain cities. The interview produced, as such interviews produce, a small wave of attention. Articles, social media engagement in the platforms that had developed since the last time such attention had organized itself around her. The brief revival of interest that follows when someone from an earlier era of public life is reminded to a contemporary audience. The attention was warm and slightly nostalgic and organized primarily around her as a figure from a glamorous past rather than as a person currently existing in a present. She received it with the composure she had always brought to the attention of the world, present for it, making use of it, and also behind the polished surface of the reception, and somewhere else entirely. Lee Radziwill died on February 15, 2019, in her apartment in New York. She was 85 years old. The cause of death was not publicly specified beyond the general language of natural causes, which is the form that deaths of very old people take in press releases when the specific details are considered private, and the family has chosen to manage the information with the discretion that the family had always applied to things it considered private. She died in the apartment rather than in a hospital, which is something, and she died in February, in a city that in February has a quality of gray compressed cold that makes the season feel like an ending, even when it isn't one. The obituaries appeared within hours of the announcement in the publications and platforms that maintain the infrastructure of commemorating the deaths of people who were once significantly public. They were extensive. The New York Times ran a piece that covered several columns, organized around the familiar architecture of Lee Radziwill's public life, the Bouvier childhood, the marriages, the title, the Kennedy years, the social world of the 1960s and 1970s, the friendship with Capote and Warhol, the career attempts, the survival into an era when the world that had made her had largely ceased to exist. The piece was well researched and professionally executed and organized, as virtually all public accounts of Lee Radziwill's life were organized, primarily around her relationship to Jackie Kennedy. The relationship to Jackie organized the obituaries not through any failure of the people writing them, but through the accurate reflection of what the historical record contained. When you assemble what is documented about Lee Radziwill's life, the photographs, the press coverage, the interviews, the memoirs and biographies that mention her, what you find is a life documented primarily in relation to other people's lives. She appears most fully in the record when she is standing next to her sister, or sitting at her sister's table, or traveling in her sister's orbit, or being described by journalists whose primary interest is in Jackie and who include Lee as context, as texture, as the person who illuminates the subject by contrast or by proximity. This is not how Lee had wished to exist in the record. The evidence of her adult life, the theater, the television, the design work, the memoir she never finished, the interviews she gave across 60 years, suggests with consistency that she had wanted to be understood as someone whose significance was her own, rather than borrowed, whose presence in any room was the result of who she was, rather than whose sister she happened to be. The documentary record of her life assembled across those same 60 years does not support that self-understanding. It supports the other understanding, the one that the social world had always maintained, and that Lee had spent her adult life working to revise without succeeding. The estate she left behind was the subject of limited public discussion, in the way that the estates of people without dynastic fortunes and without publicly contested wills tend to be. She had not, by the accounts of people familiar with her financial situation in her later years, died wealthy in the sense that the early years of her life might have suggested. The Radziwill marriage had produced a title and a social world, but not, in the end, a fortune that survived the divorce and the passing of time intact. The Ross marriage had been comfortable, but not on the scale of the early Radziwill years. The design work had generated income, but not the kind of income that produces legacies. The apartment in New York, beautiful and carefully maintained, was the primary material expression of the life she had lived, and it would be sold as apartments are sold, and its contents would be dispersed through the mechanisms that distribute the objects of a life once the life is over. The objects themselves were significant. The auction of a portion of Lee's belongings, conducted after her death, produced the kind of attention that these events produce when the person who owned the objects was once sufficiently public. Bidders drawn not just by the objects themselves, but by what the objects had been adjacent to, the specific charge that proximity to a notable life gives to the ordinary things a person accumulates across 85 years. A table that had sat in one of her apartments, photographs, pieces of furniture with the specific Mongiardino quality that people who understood his work recognized immediately, things that had been in the rooms that the rooms had been in the company of. The attention these objects received was the last form that the public's attention to Lee Radziwill took, and it was organized in the specific way that posthumous auction attention is organized, around the life as container rather than as subject, around what the life had touched and held rather than around what the life had thought and felt and wanted and failed to obtain. It was, in its way, the most accurate summation available of how the public world had always received her. With genuine interest in the surfaces, with genuine appreciation for the beauty she had assembled and inhabited, and without access to or particular interest in what lay beneath the surfaces. Christina was involved in the arrangements following Lee's death in the ways that a daughter is involved in such arrangements. The practical and legal management of an estate, the decisions about belongings and apartment, and the various administrative requirements that death generates and that fall to the people who survive it. The accounts of this period, limited as they are, do not describe a daughter in the active throes of grief, so much as a daughter managing the practical consequences of a death that had been, given Lee's age and health, anticipated in the way of the deaths of very elderly parents. Not shocking, not sudden, but still final in the specific way that finality always surprises, even when it has been expected. Whether there was grief, and of what quality and complexity, is not something the record reports. Christina had not been close to her mother in the way that would have made the loss a rupture. The distance had been maintained long enough and consistently enough to have become the shape of the relationship rather than a deviation from it. What the death of a parent produces in a child who has been estranged or near estranged is a specific and particularly difficult form of grief. Not the grief of losing something that was present and sustaining, but the grief of the permanent foreclosure of the possibility that the relationship might eventually become what it had not been. That possibility, which had existed as long as Lee was alive, however theoretical it had become across the years of distance, was now closed. Whether Christina mourned it, whether the closing of that theoretical possibility produced in a woman in her late 50s who had built her life on the premise that some distances are the accurate expression of what exists between people rather than the distortion of it, a grief that she had not anticipated or had anticipated and experienced anyway, is not something the available record addresses. It is something that exists, if anywhere, in the interior life of a woman who had spent most of her adult life keeping her interior life private. The world that Lee had moved through was by 2019 almost entirely gone. The specific social world of the 1960s and 1970s that had organized her adult identity. Dalvaidu, the world of Kapodian Warhol and Rudolf Nureyev, and the European aristocratic remnant, and the Kennedy political mythology, and the specific intersection of old money and new art that New York in that period had produced, had been replaced by a world that referenced it occasionally as a glamorous past, without understanding it from the inside. The people who had been in those rooms were mostly dead. The rooms themselves had been renovated or repurposed or razed. The magazines that had documented the social world Lee moved through had folded or reorganized around different subjects for different audiences. The specific register of public attention that had made Lee Radziwill a recognizable name, the society pages, the columnists, the specific journalism of glamour that had existed from the 1950s through the 1980s, had been replaced by platforms and algorithms that operated on entirely different principles and that had no particular use for a woman whose public significance had been produced in a world those platforms had not witnessed. Anthony's work survived him in the way that television work survives, archived, occasionally referenced by the people in the industry who knew his name, not widely available or widely discussed in the way that the work of documentary filmmakers with higher profiles is discussed. He had been good at what he did. The record of what he did is not, in 2019, particularly easy to access or encounter, which is not an unusual condition for television work of the late 1980s and 1990s, and which says nothing specific about its quality. He had made things. The things existed somewhere. Jackie's reputation had continued to grow after her death, in the specific way that the reputations of iconic figures grow when they are no longer available to complicate the myth, through biographies and films and the sustained appetite of an American public for a narrative about the Kennedy years that organized the complicated reality of that period into something more manageable and more beautiful. The photographs of Jackie continued to circulate, continued to organize the public understanding of what that era had looked like and felt like and meant. Lee appeared in some of those photographs at the edges, in the background, positioned as she had always been positioned, present, visible, and adjacent to the frame's center of gravity. Her own photographs, the ones where she was the primary subject, where the camera was pointed at her rather than at her sister, were less widely circulated. The photographers who had found her most compelling, the ones who had produced the images that captured something real about what she looked like and how she occupied space, were themselves mostly dead, and the specific visual record of Lee Radziwill that those photographers had produced lived in archives and in the inventories of photography dealers and in the occasional retrospective exhibition that reminded people, briefly and locally, of what she had looked like in 1965 or 1972 or 1988. The title she had carried for 60 years, Princess Radziwill, remained in the obituaries and in the database entries, and in the way that people who referenced her would reference her for as long as she was referenced. It was the most durable external fact of her adult life, the thing that the record attached to her name most consistently, and that organized the public understanding of who she had been more than any other single fact. It was a title acquired through marriage to a man she had divorced 45 years before her death, produced by a social world that had ceased to exist in any meaningful form before she was 40 years old, and it was the thing the world most reliably used to identify her. She had wanted something that was entirely her own. The thing the world most reliably attached to her was entirely someone else's. Lee Radziwill's life lasted 85 years and left behind in the public record a remarkably consistent image. The clothes, the rooms, the photographs taken at the edges of more significant events, the name that was always someone else's name first. The image is coherent. It is also in the way of images that have been very carefully maintained across a very long time, somewhat difficult to see through. What is visible, when you look at the full span of it, is a set of costs, not the dramatic costs of a life that collapsed publicly, not the costs that produce clean narratives of rise and fall, but the quieter costs that accumulate in lives organized around the management of surfaces. The children who grew up in beautiful houses that changed too often, the daughter who found the distance between herself and her mother to be the most honest expression of what existed there, the son who died at 39 in a summer that also took his cousin, the memoir that stayed in a drawer, the conversation with Jackie that was deferred across decades and was then no longer available to have. Anthony and Christina had grown up watching a woman who was genuinely gifted and genuinely limited in ways she could not entirely see, who had given them access to extraordinary things and withheld from them the specific ordinary thing that no extraordinary access replaces. Anthony had found in his marriage to Carol and in his friendship with John Kennedy Jr., and in the work he built across a shortened career, a life of genuine content. He had found it partly by understanding with the clarity that serious illness can produce, what mattered and what didn't, and partly by having been, despite everything, the child of a woman whose real qualities, The warmth beneath the performance, the genuine interest in people, the eye that saw what was beautiful and knew why, had made it into him in some form, alongside the costs. Christina found something else. What she found, and whether it satisfied whatever she had been looking for, is not something the public record reports. She had withdrawn from the record deliberately and consistently, which is itself a form of answer to the question of what her mother's relationship to the public world had taught her. The world Lee Radziwill moved through for 60 years no longer exists in the form that produced her, the social architecture that made a woman like Lee possible. The specific combination of European aristocratic remnant and American political glamour and the particular journalism of society life that documented it all has been replaced by different structures that value different things and produce different kinds of visible women. Whether those structures are less costly to the people inside them and to the children of the people inside them is a question worth sitting with. Lee is in the photographs. She is at the edges of the famous ones and at the center of the less famous ones, and in both positions she is completely herself. The composure, the beauty, the specific quality of a woman who understood how to occupy a room and who spent a lifetime looking, with considerable skill and considerable effort, for a room that was entirely hers. Whether she found it is not a question the record answers cleanly. The record ends with an apartment in New York, a title that was someone else's, a daughter at a measured distance, and a son already 10 years gone. The photographs remain. The rooms are someone else's now.